The alarm clock rang, which meant it was another morning, which Jason was not at all happy about. And how could he be happy if he couldn't enjoy the sunlight and the view from the window? He couldn't read the morning news on the internet or even just walk to the kitchen because Jason was bedridden after being in a terrible car accident. No, Jason did not become an invalid who couldn't walk. He suffered damage to his vision, after which he began to have trouble seeing flickering or some blurry spots in front of his eyes. After waking up, the senses that had already surrounded him returned. Only the blindfold that had been put on his eyes after the surgery. The drops from his eyes came again, and his body ached mercilessly. There wasn't even a dozen centimeters of healthy skin on his body. It was still covered with purple bruises. Sometimes it hurt to even lift his arm. Jason had always imagined blindness differently. He thought it was absolute darkness, perfect, black and deep. In reality, lights flashed on and off in front of him, constant flashes of mangled optic nerves from which there was no way to escape or close his eyes. So helpless he had never felt before, and it was maddening. Jason wanted to just get up, walk around, get some fresh air, and enjoy the view of the park near his house, to live the life of a normal person. After the accident, Jason had come to appreciate the simple things that made him happy. All the while, he wondered how his brakes could have failed. After all, the man had recently bought a car, not from hand, but from a showroom. A foreign car of excellent quality, which was recommended to him by a colleague, as he had been driving one for several years. "I'm going for a manicure," Ashley said in a dry voice, bringing the man out of his thoughts. "For how long?" Jason asked, staring blindly at the wall. "I don't know. Then I want to go to the restaurant and have lunch." She stood in front of the mirror and applied bright red lipstick to her lips. Then she twirled around, pulled up her gorgeous Italian stockings, put on a short dress, adjusted her lush breasts, and smiled to herself. "I see. So you won't be back for a while," Jason sighed. "Don't miss me," she said, rolling her eyes, which he thankfully didn't see. She was pissed off about the whole infirm husband thing. Ashley was a pipe dream for many men. A slender girl straight out of a glossy cover. With one look from under her long eyelashes, she could take any man captive, captivate him, and make him her plaything. Confident and passionate enough to make Jason lose his head after the first night with her. It was worth it for Jason to be generous with expensive gifts, as Ashley did, to get everything he could dream of. The only thing Ashley couldn't give him was selfless love. Jason had been warned before they married that women like her were very mercantile, marrying for money alone. Jason had a lot of money because he had inherited a huge house, a lot of valuable antiques, and a lot of money from his rich parents, who had passed away a few years ago. Jason was a late child, and his father and mother failed to have children for a long time, and at some point they even despaired. But fate gave them Jason, whom they raised in love and well-being, although they could not devote much time to him because of the business. However, they gave him many things and toys, but they tried not to spoil him too much, so that Jason would not grow up selfish like other children from their social circle. They also taught him that money will come from someone who knows its value and doesn't waste it. And that's a lesson Jason has remembered for the rest of his life, which helped him to achieve the heights in his career. Not so long ago, Jason could afford a vacation at a ski resort with his beautiful wife, skiing on the slopes of the Alpine mountains and not thinking about anything. And now his optimism was fading more and more every day. And the smile had long since disappeared from his face. And who could instill this optimism in him? His wife didn't care about Jason at all, thinking only of her own comfort and appearance. Ashley only told him she was going somewhere, or that she wanted to get away from him alone, because the sight of her husband depressed her. She didn't want to give in to negative emotions. Nightmares often plagued Jason, and at night he could wake up screaming. Jason was completely demoralized and motivated by what had happened. The longing was eating away at him. At times he even refused to eat, and Ashley didn't insist. Though she had tried to feed him at first, her words, her attitude toward him, hurt the man too. After all, despite everything, he tried to make their marriage strong, normal, diverse. They traveled constantly and tried not to deny themselves anything. And this was the thanks Jason got for all his years of effort. Ashley slammed the door, and he could hear her footsteps moving away. When he'd lost some of his senses, he'd sharpened others. Except his hearing wasn't much help walking through the traitorously huge house. The spaciousness he had valued so much was at once his enemy. It was now that he could take a few steps to the toilet, and with respite and rest. But right after the hospital, he'd been bedridden and unable to get up due to his many injuries. Ashley, of course, did not care for him, as she refused. So Jason was visited by a specially hired worker in the mornings and evenings. It had been the worst time of his life, and now he was glad that he could take 10 steps to the toilet. The man even counted and memorized exactly how many were required, as each step caused him incredible pain and suffering. Being home alone was unbearable. Jason's thoughts were always dark, so when Ashley returned from the beauty parlor, he asked her to find him a caregiver. She shrugged indifferently and agreed, but it wasn't so easy. The first caregiver was not performing her duties well. She was constantly distracted by the phone, ignored Jason's requests, and even insulted him when he asked her to take him to the bathroom, for which she was immediately fired. The second caregiver didn't try very hard to perform her duties well either. She did everything mechanically and lacked the warmth that Jason lacked. Ashley complained that the nurse had tried to steal a sapphire ring from her jewelry box. They didn't want a thief in the house, so they fired her. "Ashley, do you even read reviews when you hire someone?" Jason was outraged. "I'm not stupid, of course I do. It's not my fault they're fake," she said. "All right, I'll choose my own caregiver." "And how's that? You can't see anything. You can't tell by your voice. You give me the phone when you call the next number. What are you, crazy? We're sure to run into another con artist or murderer." "Could you open the window, please?" Jason asked suddenly. Ashley was no longer surprised at his behavior. She opened the window and let the cool, fresh air in. "Is it raining?" Jason smiled. "I'll have to ask him to take down the bottom branch of the poplar tree. The wind's going to break it soon." "How would you know?" Ashley marveled as she watched the poplars bend to the ground in the wind. "I can hear it. I won't see the poplar tree again, or you or my nurse, but I will hear it all. Just do as I ask, won't you?" Jason no longer believed that his sight would ever return to him. After all, the surgery he did hadn't worked. "Okay," Ashley said. She felt uncomfortable with her husband's antics. The next day, Ashley put Jason on the phone so he could talk to the candidates. She quickly grew bored with it, because one had a rough voice, another had an unpleasant hoarseness, and the third couldn't even speak because she had a cold. But he was won over by one girl who had a very sweet and pleasant voice that immediately charmed Jason. Listening to her, the man seemed to come alive. He felt warm and pleasant. He wanted to listen to her talk again and again. But it was not only the pleasant voice, but also Jason's associations. The girl reminded him of his first love, who had the same sweet little voice. Oh, how Jason had been in love with her. How he went crazy over his feelings and lost his head around her. It was the best time of his life. "Can I come over with my son? He's very quiet. He'll be fine for you. It's just that he loves me very much, and he gets cranky a lot, and he's scared without me," she asked. Jason smiled and leaned back on the pillow. "I have a big house. There's plenty of room for everyone, so don't worry about that. Thank you. I'll see you tomorrow." Jason nodded and ended the call, letting his wife Ashley know that he had chosen a caregiver. She hummed and left the house again. This time he was saving himself. Jason looked forward to the arrival of his new caregiver. He liked her a lot, and he wanted to meet his son. Jason and Ashley didn't have children, though he dreamed of having them. But his wife was against it, not wanting to ruin her figure in life, believing that children were a burden. Jason could not change her mind. Soon he resigned himself to the fact that he would remain childless. Rubbing the bridge of his nose, he remembered the voice of the girl he'd spoken to recently. It plunged him into a long ago, but so warm, cozy memories that gave him goosebumps. He loved to escape into them from the harsh reality devoid of love and understanding. For 7 whole years, it was his protected paradise island, where he wanted to live, not to exist in illusions and happiness. Had he ever had happiness in this marriage? Jason tried to remember, but nothing good came to mind. No one ever greeted him from work, never gave him a hot dinner, or even basic care and affection. His wife was almost always away from home, either at fitness, social events, or beauty salons. Jason often blamed Ashley for making him unhappy. She didn't want anything but herself. However, the man realized that he had only himself to blame. No one had dragged him to the registry office or forced him to marry Ashley. Jason had been told that he wouldn't find happiness in a marriage with her. But then he just waved it off, assuring everyone that he'd be fine and not to worry. Jason was eager to succeed in business as quickly as possible. Going head over, he saw the goal and saw no obstacles. Money and power intoxicated the guy, because of which he broke up 7 years ago with his favorite girl, Emily, with whom he met only a few months. But then Jason did not suspect that these would be the happiest months of his life, which he would remember with warmth, and sometimes with tears. Jason still didn't understand why his perfect relationship had come to an end. They were doing well. And then the sun of happiness had been blocked out by dense gray clouds, and there was nothing he could do about it. Jason was inclined to think that the problem was either his job and his constant workload or the unfounded jealousy that often plagued him. In the first case, Emily didn't complain, but only occasionally asked Jason to stay with her after work. She missed her lover all day long. She tried to make him happy, baking a cherry pie or giving him a massage. But it was as if it went unnoticed because Jason was always thinking and talking only about work, not interested in how Emily was doing, how her day was going, whether she was worried about anything. In the second case, Jason was often furious when he saw Emily with other men, even though she never gave him any reason to be jealous. But Jason successfully found them on his own. His girlfriend was very beautiful, and she always had many admirers. But Emily was faithful to Jason, which she often reminded him of. Once he even got into a fight when Emily was talked down to by her ex-boyfriend from high school. Their relationship couldn't be called serious. Emily told Jason about it. Then one day he showed up at Emily's workplace drunk to win her back. Before she could say anything, Jason punched the guy in the face. Then again and again, the police were called, but Jason was able to pay them off. But the ex never showed up again. However, such behavior scared Emily insanely. There was another ridiculous incident at the store that made Jason angry. "I saw the way you looked at your acquaintance. You're only with me for the money." His words were like a slap in the face to Emily. "How can you say that? I love you for nothing." For nothing, she once again tried to convince Jason, but he had a hard time believing it, because in high school many girls were only interested in him because of money. Jason wasn't exactly handsome or confident at the time. Despite the presence of large sums of money, he was someone who aspired to finish school well enough to enter a prestigious university to study economics. However, Jason had no experience in relationships and socializing with girls, so he got badly burned several times when girls, after saying "I love you," would say, "You have money, buy me something." Jason didn't realize this right away, so he continued to mislead beautiful girls with his beautiful confessions. But once his naivety was gone, came insecurity and some callousness, which was reflected in his relationship with Emily. "If you really loved me that much, you wouldn't be badgering me about my job or looking at other guys," Jason muttered. "I can't believe all of this," Emily said tearfully, wiping her temples. "I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving." "Well, there. I knew it. Probably leaving for that guy, just looking for an excuse to break up with me." Jason laughed in frustration. "Think whatever you want to think. If it makes you feel better to think I want someone else, then be my guest." That same evening, Emily packed her bags and left for her hick town. Jason believed she would still come back, but she never did. His parents said it was even better, because they never liked Emily. They kept convincing their son that he needed another girl, a well-off girl from a good family, not some waitress with only a 9th-grade education. This also partly influenced Jason and Emily's breakup, although it never bothered Jason that Emily worked as a waitress at a roadside cafe, which incidentally she used to perform at on her days off. The thing was, she had a beautiful voice. Emily was a good singer. On the days she performed, the place was jam-packed. Jason himself was fascinated by her singing. He often went to that cafe to see Emily perform. And then, when they started dating, she performed at Jason's firm at corporate events for a good fee. Everyone praised Jason's choice, as his co-workers really liked Emily. She was a sweet, smart, and pleasant girl with a lot to talk about. It was a shame Jason had been stupidly blind back then and let her walk away. He should have stopped her by the hand, hugged her tightly, promised her that he would never act like the last idiot again, to finally marry her instead of delaying the moment, since Jason had proposed soon enough. But the wedding was dragging on and on. Citing a busy schedule and bad timing, she waited, not pressuring him. She thought the man should come to it on his own. But Jason didn't seem eager to take their relationship to the next level. Moreover, he took the coziness that Emily had created not only in the house but in their relationship for granted. And having lost it, Jason couldn't recover for a long time because devastation followed, and there were no more cozy evenings, heartfelt conversations, or just basic care. There was no more love and understanding. Realizing what he'd done, Jason tried to get Emily back. Every day he called her more than once, but instead of her sweet and beloved voice, he heard a dry. The caller is temporarily unavailable. Again and again he was confronted with the cold voice of a robot, and it drove Jason to drink a lot, so he wouldn't think about the pain and lost happiness. He tried to find her, but it was very difficult, because the man did not know her exact address, and connections and reference services could not help him. Then Jason decided to go to the provincial town where she lived, hoping that he would be able to find her on his own, but it was as if luck had turned against him. Although he didn't know Emily had seen him, she just wouldn't go near him. She was terrified that her feelings would override her mind and that she wouldn't be able to help herself and go back to Jason. And then the peace of her life would be gone, and the reproach and detachment from him would return. Emily walked past him, unnoticed. And then the worst happened. Jason sat in his office, sorting through a backlog of papers. His phone kept ringing and ringing. But Jason ignored the calls for a long time, until he was startled by the annoying noise and ringtone, and answered the call in a gruff voice. What he heard shocked him so much that the man nearly fell out of his chair. He felt dizzy, and an unpleasant lump came to his throat. Tears welled up in Jason's eyes. His beloved Emily was dead. Jason's heart was ready to stop. He'd almost died from the news, even though it had been 7 years since they'd broken up. "How did Ben tell you?" the man asked, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He hadn't heard a coherent answer. He'd learned through some acquaintances that she'd probably been seriously ill. At that moment, Jason was ready to forget himself like a wounded animal. If he'd known then, he could have helped her, saved her life, and done everything he could to get Emily back. There were still crumbs of faith in him that sooner or later they would be reunited. But one phone call had finally shattered it all. The man remembered how, after his breakup with Emily, in the heat of anger, resentment, and disappointment, he'd forbidden everyone he knew to talk about her, stopped looking for her, and then got married to numb the pain and fill his life with new colors. What Jason didn't know was that those colors wouldn't be as bright as salt, but gray and dull. Jason realized that he had made an unfortunate mistake, for which he constantly berated himself. Each time he mentally rewound time back and corrected what he'd done. And at the end of it, a happy life with his wife Emily and children awaited him. In his mind, it was the perfect picture that held Jason back and kept him from returning to reality. But as much as the man wanted to, he had to face the harsh reality. Jason thought his whole life had been stupid. A stupid breakup with his sweetheart, a stupid marriage in the heat of emotion, and a stupid car accident under bizarre circumstances that had left him practically bedridden. It was a good thing he'd survived. Though sometimes Jason wondered if he would have been better off if he hadn't. Life didn't make him happy anyway, but only depressed him. He was pulled from his thoughts by the roar of the thing's engine. Jason shrank back, his foot pressing against the floor as if he were trying to hit the brake. No matter how much he pressed the pedal, the bulky car wouldn't stop. Jason looked up as Ashley entered the room. The weather had improved since the rain, so nice, the sun droplets sparkling like diamonds. "I wish you could see it," she said. "I wish I'd married you," Jason thought. But he didn't say anything out loud. He was tired of sitting in four walls with a wife who did nothing for him and didn't even talk to him. So the man was looking forward to tomorrow morning when his wife would bring the nurse and walked her over to Jason's house. "This is Jason, my husband, and this is Rose and her son Tyler," Ashley introduced everyone. "It's a pleasure," the girl said modestly. The boy snuggled up to her. He was embarrassed by the new surroundings and the strangers. "Say hello," Rose said. "Hello," he said quietly. "Good morning. I wish I could see you," Jason smiled a little sadly. "Anyway, I'll leave you to it. I have a lot to do," Ashley said and walked away. "Well, it's just the three of us now," Rose said. Jason felt her smile. He heard the rustle of clothes and realized that Rose was helping Tyler take off his outerwear. "Tyler, how old are you?" Jason asked, looking in his direction, a little taller than the boy himself. "6, but I'll turn 7 in a few months," Tyler replied, snuggling up to his mom. "Wow, you're so big. You'll be going to school soon." "I'm not going," the boy replied. "What? Why not?" Jason was surprised. "Because they won't let me go to school," Tyler whispered to Rose, and glanced at Jason. She was embarrassed that the boy had been so nonchalant about his family's problems. Rose herself had always tried to keep things private and dealt with her own problems. "Are you having difficulties?" Jason asked. "No, I'm fine," Rose said shyly. Jason realized that the family did have some problems. He wanted her to share them. Not to help them, if he could, but to hear her soft, sweet voice. It created an inexplicable coziness around him, and it made him feel so warm. As if he were talking to Emily, she had a similar voice, almost the same. It made him feel a little uncomfortable. Jason was communicating with a wonderful girl who reminded him of his late lover. He was also overwhelmed by déjà vu. Rose seemed to reach out and touch his beloved. "Can you share everything with me?" Jason asked politely. "Maybe there's something I can help you with." "You don't have to. You hired me, and that's already a big help to me," the girl said. Jason heard Rose go into the kitchen, followed by Tyler running out. She came back, pouring tea for Jason. Rose helped him take the cup. When Jason tasted the drink, he got goosebumps. Déjà vu all over again. It was the same tea Emily and her daughters had made: orange, lemon, mint, and honey. Jason loved that tea, and Emily often spoiled him. "When I'd come home from work tired, you'd go crazy. The dead don't go to the living. You just lose your mind from powerlessness, Jason said to himself as he tried to chase away the image of Emily. I'll make you guys some lunch a little later. Is there anything you might want to listen to? TV, radio, or some video from the internet? Rose inquired. No, thank you. The tea is delicious, by the way, Jason replied. Are you from out of town or from around here? We're newcomers from a small town, but we moved here to start a new life. Really, I didn't realize it would be so hard to live in a metropolis. It's hard to find a job and support yourself. The girl shook her head sympathetically. Jason knew that people who came here for the paradisiacal life had a hard time here. Many people couldn't keep up with the pace of the big city, became disillusioned, and left. Every year there were more and more of them, because the metropolis dictated its own rules, and not everyone could obey them. I'm sorry. It's not easy to settle here, Jason said. Yeah, but I'm not used to giving up. I have someone to fight for. There's nothing to do in our province. Men start drinking as early as their 20s. Other than the factory, there's nothing. Tyler's a very special boy. He's very smart, but modest. He should go to college after high school. I know he's going to make it, and I really want to help him do it. I'm sure he will. But why can't he go to school? We don't have a propiska or connections here to get anything, even if only temporarily. Getting into school now isn't as easy as it used to be. Rose sighed heavily. And there's no money to dress him properly. I don't want him to be any different from the other kids. Nowadays, fancy clothes make kids a scapegoat. And if you don't have a fancy phone, you become a loser. But that's okay. We're not used to it. Saving money, the girl added cheerfully. Tyler and I will still have a life. We just have to wait. And where do you live? We rent a small room in a communal apartment. It's just enough for us. It's like they say, small is small. The main thing is that Tyler goes to school. That's my main goal right now. I've been saving as much money as I can from my town. I used to work as a social worker, taking care of old people, the disabled. I'm doing the same thing here. Although I've always dreamed of being a singer, Rose smiled and plunged into her dreams for a second. Can you imagine? A singer? Yeah, I'm a pretty good singer. I've performed many times at the House of Culture in my town. Jason froze and didn't know what to say. There were too many coincidences. The similar voice, the signature tea, and the performances. Could it really be Emily? What if she wasn't dead? What if there's a chance she's sitting in front of him right now? No, that's impossible. The girl's name is Roseanne. Emily would recognize Jason, and she'd probably leave, and she wouldn't work for him. She's dead. Dead, the man shook his head. Everything okay? Rose asked caringly and took Jason's hand. Do you need me to go get you some medicine or make you something special? No, thanks. The man smiled genuinely, feeling a rush of warmth from Rose's concern. You know, I really want to help you and Tyler. You don't have to, the girl quipped and blushed. Tyler jokingly called her a tomato, causing her to blush even more. You don't say no to me. I've made a decision to help you. And it doesn't stand for any objections, Jason said seriously. But Rose didn't give up. I can't. Now, will you excuse me? Listen to me. Jason fumbled for her hand. I've done a lot of stupid things in my life, and I wasn't exactly a generous man. A lot of people wished I'd died in that accident. But I survived, and I can't do anything. I'm blind, and I can't even leave the house. But I can help you. Don't refuse me. Let me bring happiness to you at least. Or she couldn't refuse him. Whether out of politeness or embarrassment. Or maybe she just believed him. No, I don't like soup. And anyway, I had dinner at a restaurant, Ashley said proudly. Ashley, could you be more polite? Jason frowned. I didn't say anything like that. Rose is our maid. I replied normally that I wasn't hungry, first of all. Rose is not a maid. Second, you will not be rude to my employees in my house. Do you understand? Otherwise, I'll have your bank card revoked, Jason warned her. He didn't look like a broken cripple who couldn't even walk to the bathroom. His desire to stand up for Emily gave him strength and grit. Ashley couldn't find anything to say, but it was obvious she was angry. It made Rose uncomfortable. She was afraid Ashley would fire her, and then she'd lose her only income. I almost forgot, Jason smiled. I suspect that the room you're living in isn't the best of conditions. It's not nice, not human. You can stay here, in my house. There's plenty of room for everyone. Most of the rooms are empty anyway. Emily opened her mouth in shock, unable to say a word. Ashley, on the other hand, glared at her husband. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. Except Jason didn't care whether Tyler liked it or not. They'd made his life more interesting and fun in just one day. If we could accept the clothes, what else did you buy them to wear? Ashley was outraged. Don't you think that's a little much? Why don't we do another charity event? I think, Jason replied dryly, that it's my money in my house, and I can use it however I want. Jason, really, you shouldn't. Yes, you should. How's Tyler going to learn in a small apartment? You could be evicted at any moment. You realize I'm the one who can't afford to let that happen. I'll give you and Tyler a large room. You can use the nursery if you want, don't you think? Jason smiled. He was pleased to surprise her. Tyler immediately went over to his mother and hugged her. Jason clearly heard the boy's whispered request. Mom, let's stay. Rose was still in shock. She hadn't realized she'd ever lived in such luxurious surroundings. Jason's house reminded her of all the houses she'd seen in Hollywood movies. It was scary for her to even dream of such conditions. The situation was really untold. She hadn't told Jason how they had to stand in line just to wash up, and if, of course, they were lucky enough to have water at all. There was a family down the hall. Their son was always bullying Tyler, guarding the entryway, and in the next room lived an ex-military man, drunk and violent, who tried to get Rose into bed. Jason, does your wife mind? I don't want to be a bone of contention in your family. I don't think about it. You're not going to get in our way. Justin will take you to get your things, and then he'll bring you back. His voice was soft but commanding. How could Rose resist a man? When they packed up and left, his wife gave Jason a hard time. You're out of your mind. She's going to rob us and then go somewhere else, the wife said, pacing the room from side to side. I feel she's a good person. He feels it, If he could see, he'd know she's a crook. Just waiting to take all my jewelry and your money, the wife didn't even discuss it. Rose and Tyler are going to live with us. Whether you want them to or not, what do you care? You're hardly ever home anyway. Is that it? Tyler won't stress you out in any way, Jason smiled, and his smile made Ashley really angry. You'll be without everything. You'll remember what I said. You're a grown man, but you're acting like a naive child. Better take the dishes to the kitchen. There was a cup of tea on the table next to Jason, the kettle unusable. Here's another thing. Let the nurse do it. Besides, you won't have to wait long, Ashley grumbled. And then Jason heard the front door slam. It was the first time he had ever been so relieved that his spouse had gone somewhere. Rose and Tyler returned about an hour later. Jason instructed Justin to escort them to the guest room. It was a spacious bedroom that had its own bathroom and mini fridge. Tyler was so excited to see the huge bed that he immediately started jumping on it. Tyler, don't stop it, Rose said softly. God forbid you break it again. It's so nice here, Mom, the boy said enthusiastically. I want to thank Jason. We'll go down to him together now, son. Rose smiled and kissed him on the forehead. Rose and Tyler. They walked down to Jason, who was already waiting for them. They thanked him, and then Rose carried the dishes into the kitchen, put hot soup in a bowl, and brought it to Jason. He, meanwhile, was busy with Tyler, who was telling him that he had recently read a book about dinosaurs. Pardon the stupid question, but are you kids yourselves, or do you need help with that? Jason caught the embarrassment in her voice and smiled for some reason. Rose seemed such a sweet, humble, and incredibly kind person to him. I can do it on my own. But I wouldn't mind if you and Tyler kept me company, Rose said. No one had ever treated her the way Jason had. He seemed like a fairy tale prince without the white horse. She saw kindness and nobility in him. After dinner, Rose washed the dishes, tucked Tyler in, and went downstairs to Jason, who was still awake. She suggested that he listen to the book Rose had brought with her. Jason agreed. No one had ever read to him before, except his mom when he was little. Rose brought a story about love. Jason couldn't call himself a sentimental person before, but as he listened to Rose's voice, as he took in the meaning of the book's lines, he felt some strange emotions stirring in him. They stirred his soul and tugged at its strings. Jason even wept, but the tears were quickly absorbed into the fabric of the hateful bandage. He longed to get rid of it. It was a strip of thick cloth stuffed with gauze that only created the illusion that things would get better and only delayed the inevitable. There was no change. Still the same flashes of light in the dark that drove him crazy, although he had been promised that they would soon disappear when his sight began to return. When his wife arrived home, she was not happy with the nurse reading books to her husband. She didn't like her son or the whole situation. The wife even thought of somehow framing the caregiver to get her and her back out of the house immediately, but she stopped herself in time. The woman thought that even setup would not have to, because she was sure that this girl is a fraud and that she would give herself away. But Rose did not even think about taking something foreign. She spent all her time focusing on Jason and Tyler. She tutored Tyler, getting him ready for school, and she took good care of Jason, cooking delicious meals, helping him get dressed and out on the balcony so he could get some fresh air. She read him books and downloaded their audio versions so he wouldn't be bored. But most of all, Jason loved talking to her. She talked about her life without going into too much detail, as if she were afraid or ashamed of her past, or maybe she just didn't think it was necessary to go into it in such detail. I noticed you like music. Would you like to go to a concert? Yeah, but how am I going to get to it? I can't see, and it can be painful to walk. I'll help you to your car and to the concert hall, and Justin will drive us. You stay home all the time, Jason. It can drive you crazy. Rose took his hand. And trust me, you're going to love it. Jason couldn't say no to Rose. He had grown attached to the nurse, and that affection was helping Jason to regain his will to live. Whereas a few days ago he'd wanted to die, now it was as if he'd taken a breath of fresh air, which was good for him. Rose noticed it too. She was glad that Jason was revitalized and even on the mend. At the concert, Jason felt like a normal person, even though he had a patch over his eyes. But it didn't bother him anymore. Why see when you could hear such beautiful music and singing? The singer's voice penetrated so deep into the man's heart that he wept. And this time Rose noticed his tears. She smiled and took his hand. She loved the man's vivid emotions. That was an amazing concert. Thank you for getting me out of the house, Rose. They walked carefully to the cab. Justin couldn't give them a ride today since he was taking Ashley shopping and still hadn't gotten off work. Did you need this, Jason? You know that the most beautiful flowers die if you don't give them sunlight, heat, and water. Of course I do. You remind me of a flower like that. My heart sank when I first saw you. Why are you smiling now? Enjoy life and you're happy. It makes me feel better myself. It's all because of you. Then let's get married. I think we're close enough for that, Jason smiled, stroking my palm with his fingers. I don't mind. The girl's heart fluttered. Jason had been in a good mood after the concert, but it lifted even more when he heard Rose singing. She sat next to him, knitting and humming the song she had heard at the concert. Jason remembered the pain again, for she sang just as beautifully, heartfelt and special. Rose, do you sing very beautifully? I think you sing better than that singer, he said. You flatter me, she blushed. No, I'm telling you the truth, Jason said, and touched his bandage, as was his habit. Jason, why don't you have the surgery again? I'm sure it can be fixed. No, you're not. This surgery was supposed to help, but I can't even see light. Is it really pitch black? No, not even a spark of light. Jason shook his head with a sad smile. It's different. Imagine a camera flash dancing right in front of your eyes and you can't look away. That's what blindness really is. Do you need a second surgery? I heard what the doctor said when he came to see you. Don't despair. You might be able to see again soon. Isn't that great? I'm surprised at your optimism, Jason smiled. Do you think it's worth a try? Sure, of course. Give yourself a chance to start over. You've got nothing to lose. You're already blind, and it can't get any worse, she grinned. It doesn't look like it will, Jason continued. He'd been thinking about it for days, and he'd finally agreed. Tyler had even made him a little good luck charm that his grandmother had taught him to make in the village. Thank you, Tyler, I'll keep it, Jason said. Everything will be all right. But when Rose hugged Jason, Ashley saw it. I think you're out of line, the woman said unhappily. It's just a hug, Jason interceded. You're not hugging me. But Rose could see that the woman was uncomfortable with it. Tyler squirmed at the sight of Ashley and pressed himself against his mother. If I find out that you kicked Tyler out, you'll never set foot here again, Jason warned Ashley at once, realizing that his wife was capable of a lot of things. She snorted and retreated to her bedroom. Rose helped Jason into the car, and he mentally hoped that she would miss him as much as he missed her. Justin turned on the engine, started the car, and then stopped. The brakes are fine, Justin said tiredly. Now, Jason had a thing for that, and Justin was sticking to it. Jason knew people who'd been in accidents. It wasn't uncommon among owners of expensive fast cars. According to the survivors, it was instantaneous. They didn't even have time to be frightened or realize what was happening. But in Jason's case, it wasn't like that. He wasn't driving like a madman. It was just a normal business trip to an office outside the city. The highway meandered through the woods, and Jason was wrapped up in thoughts of work and Rose each time. He ran through his mind with thoughts of how he'd go back to her, a apologize, marry her right that very day. But it was too late. Without distracting himself from those thoughts, Jason pressed the brake pedal on automatic before the steep curve. It was only when he realized the car wasn't slowing down that he sobered up. The jackknife, with the ravine behind it, was getting closer, and the pedal was sliding to the floor. His hands cramped. The way he tried to twist the steering wheel seemed to last forever. He kept going until the bumper crumpled like paper and his car went down. In all those long seconds, there was only one thought in his mind: and I'm going to die upon waking up. Pain was immediately felt. The whole body was burning. There was no strength to even open his eyes, and his eyelids ached mercilessly. But when he did open his eyes, the pain in his body seemed like a trifle. Ripping off the IVs, he began to fumble with his face, thinking he was wearing a bandage or that it was too dark around him. Even in front of his very eyes, he could see nothing. It was then that realization came. Jason's screams and desperate cries made even the experienced doctor's hearts clench. He screamed, begging them to let him die. Blindness frightened him more than anything else. Jason wasn't afraid of losing his limbs, but blindness seemed the worst. What could happen to him? He had no hope of regaining his sight now, but he was still going to the clinic. For the sake of it, he wanted to see her. And if there was even the slightest chance of that, he had to take it within the next few days. The atmosphere in the house was tense. Ashley almost hissed when they met either in the kitchen or in the hallway. Tyler didn't even leave the room, so as not to piss off the lady of the house. But one day he did go out, thinking his wife had gone somewhere. Tyler wanted to take a cookie, but when she saw it, she told him not to. "Did your mom buy these cookies?" Ashley pulled it out and threw it. No, the boy lowered his gaze and sighed heavily. "Then it's not your cookie and you have no right to touch it." Please, Tyler looked at Ashley with a pleading look, but she was adamant. The boy went back to his room in tears. Rose stepped out of the shower and immediately walked over to him. "What's wrong, son?" "Nothing. I just bumped my finger on the nightstand." "Well, honey, be more careful next time," Rose kissed him. "Would you like me to make you an apple pie, your favorite?" "Yes, of course I do." Tyler immediately perked up and hugged his mom. "Then I'll go to the store and get some groceries, and then you can help me in the kitchen." "Okay, Mom." Emily was in a great mood, because tomorrow she would pick Jason up from the hospital. The surgery had been a success. Soon the man should have his sight back. However, he would have to wear a bandage for a while longer. The girl herself did not notice how she fell in love with him, but of course she kept her feelings to herself. After all, Jason was a married man, though there was no love and happiness in his marriage. As Emily was walking back with a bag of groceries, she saw Ashley and Justin kissing. It made her feel uncomfortable, and she walked into her room on woozy legs. The girl suspected that Ashley might be cheating on Jason, but not with the driver. She felt so bad for him, but she couldn't tell him about it. It was someone else's family, and she had no right to pry. "Mom, are you okay? You don't look okay, do you?" Tyler asked. "I'm fine, don't worry about it," Emily said with a wry smile. "I'm just a little tired." It took her a lot of effort to fight down her raging emotions. Jason is blind as a mole in every way. How could he not see the affair between his wife and the driver? I wish I could tell him the truth, but I can't. Sooner or later, he'll find out for himself. Emily drove to the hospital first thing in the morning to pick up Jason. She wanted Ashley to come with her, because her spouse should be there for her husband at a time like this. But she'd gone somewhere else and hadn't told Emily Jason was going to have his bandage removed today, and he was glad to have Emily by his side at this important moment. When Jason opened his eyes, he almost passed out. The light was hitting his eyes. And then he saw her, and his head spun. "Doctor," he noticed his patient's abnormal state and immediately held a smelling salt shaker in front of his nose. "Are you all right?" "Emily," Jason whispered. "Emily, it's you. Are you back?" Jason tried to get up, but sat down. Everything around him swam with emotion. "Am I dead? Am I dead?" he asked. It could be the effects of the surgery. Calm down, the doctor carefully placed Jason on the hospital bed. "You are more alive than ever, and you can see now." Emily was a carbon copy of the late Rose, the same long black hair, brown eyes, pale skin. They were two peas in a pod. She took Jason's hand, and he shuddered, looking at her sadly. "I'm not Rose," Emily said. "She died a few years ago." "I'm her sister." "Jason, did you know her?" Yes, he was dumbfounded and pronounced. He felt hot, and drops of sweat appeared on his forehead. "Let's go home. We'll talk about everything there." Jason wiped away tears all the way to the cab. He was afraid to look in Rose's direction. She reminded him so much of his first, unforgotten love, that she still worried him to this day. Tyler was worried about him and constantly asked his mom why he was crying. Rose calmly told the boy not to ask uncomfortable questions right now. Jason couldn't even think about how the day would turn out. He was also waiting for the moment when the blindfold would be removed, when he would see through and see the girl who had become so close to him. But he saw the ghost of the one he loved, the one he had betrayed and abandoned. Jason kept thinking about the fact that Emily had died because of him. At home, Rose made Jason's favorite tea. He sat pensively in the living room, staring at one point without moving. "Jason, how did you know my sister? I loved her. She was my first true love. Oh my God, are you the guy who broke her heart?" Now Rose was shocked. "Yes, I'm the idiot." Jason smiled sadly, stood up and walked to the window. "Emily died because of me. It's my fault." He had waited so long for the day he could see, and now his dream had come true. Jason saw trees in front of him, a well-kept yard, sunshine, and a clear sky, but he didn't feel any joy. He was overcome with uncontrollable excitement, his heart pounding like a frenzy, his body in nervous waves. He hadn't expected or been prepared to see an exact replica of Emily in front of him. "Is that why their voices are identical? I didn't know Emily had a twin. I didn't know anything about you. Emily never talked about you, and you never talked about me. In fact, we barely spoke to each other our whole lives until she moved back to the city from here. She was broken and depressed. Wouldn't say your name, but she said you weren't a bad person, but you were too dry and insecure. And that's what led to the breakup. Yes, it was my fault we broke up. I still can't forgive myself for that. Emily was the perfect girl for me, and I was blind, even with good eyesight." Jason grinned. "I learned of her death not too long ago. She had cancer. I could have saved her." "No, she died in childbirth," Rose interrupted him. She looked back. "Emily came in pregnant, 3 months pregnant, said it was that guy's baby. I mean, your baby. She didn't even want to show her face to you, even though she'd seen you in town. I was scared, and she didn't want to stir up the past, but she was really looking forward to Tyler. She loved her son before he was born. She didn't even get to see him. She had complications, bleeding, and died." Oh my God, Jason was dumbfounded by this information. Tyler was his son, the son of his beloved. "I didn't know anything for so many years. Why?" Jason lowered his head, running his fingers through his hair and squeezing them hard. "If I had known, I would have made sure my son never needed anything." "Jason, don't blame yourself." Rose sat down in front of him and held his hands. "Yes, Tyler and I lived poorly, but in love and prosperity. He may be my nephew, but I love him like my own son. After Emily died, I adopted Tyler. He doesn't know anything about it. And for now, he doesn't need to know that his real mom is dead. I want him to know he has a father." Jason raised his tearful eyes to Rose, and her heart squeezed. "He'll know, but we'll tell him later." "God, I can't believe that fate brought us together like this. It's no accident. Jason, I think Emily sent me to you so that my son and father could be reunited, so that you could help me start my life over." Jason squeezed her fragile hands and kissed them. Rose blushed, turned her face away with an embarrassed smile. "I'm sorry for the way I treated your sister. I think I forgave you long ago. And now there's Tyler in the sky watching you with a happy smile. Now I can't let you or Tyler go. Will you stay here with me? We're going to be a family." "What? What about your wife?" Was she surprised? "I think you've noticed there's no love in our marriage. There never was any. Maybe just some illusion of it. But that dissipated too quickly. I love you. And not because you look like Emily. No, I loved you before I even saw you. And it's so beautiful. My feelings revitalized me. I felt happy again, the warmth I'd missed for so long." Jason kissed Rose, and Ashley came into the living room. "What's going on here?" she asked. "Have you lost your conscience? Do you want to marry a rich man?" "You won't," Ashley shouted. "Calm down. I've been thinking about filing for divorce and never seeing or hearing from you again," Jason said seriously, looking at his wife. She was still as beautiful as ever, except she had no soul. "Until she showed up at our house, you never said anything to me about divorce," Ashley said. "Nikita, that hick is messing with your head, and you're just Ira. She'll trick you and then run away with her $1 million. "I love you," Ashley said. "I think there's only one person here who's interested in my $1 million. Jason's gaze flickered with animosity toward his wife. "I'm filing for divorce, period. I don't want a wife who doesn't want me," he said. "What a freak," Ashley shrieked. "Yes, I wasted the best years of my life on you. In the heat of emotion, she grabbed a candlestick from the table and wanted to hit her husband, who was weak from the surgery. But Rose intercepted her hand. "I don't touch him," she said, taking the candlestick. "You have sins of your own." "What are you talking about?" Ashley asked. "I saw you kissing the driver. Are you having an affair with him?" "What? You're out of your mind. I would never cheat on my husband." Ashley justified herself, but she could tell she was lying. "I know it was you and him that caused the accident, that you messed up the brakes. I couldn't sleep tonight, and I witnessed your conversation. You were planning another assassination attempt on Jason, and the motive is simple: money and love. Jason was preventing you from seeing Justin freely, and if he died, you would have your freedom and all of his assets as his wife." Ashley tried to say something, but all thoughts were out of her head. Rose turned pale. She hustled toward Jason, not knowing how to clear her name. Jason clenched his fists, but Rose calmed him down by putting a hand on his shoulder. A nurse was fired for saving a homeless man. But when the town's mayor arrived at the hospital with a billionaire B4. At hours, Provincetown Medical Center No. 4 in Kansas was buzzing. Ambulance duty. The town celebrated its 50th anniversary over the summer. Houses with carved lace, real snowy winters with frost and snowfall, institutes and universities, and of course hospitals. But this medical center has a bad reputation. It is called a branch of the cemetery for the high mortality rate of patients not only during the epidemic, but also in times of peace from the war with viruses. Why? The question is rhetorical. At the same time, everyone is brought here by ambulance, ordinary decent citizens with residence registration and official place of work, and maimed or frostbitten, drunk, homeless and unconscious drug addicts. Nurses did not like the latter category. And with good reason. "These guys are bringing in bums and alcoholics again. Damn it," Kimberly grumbled. "Last time I did all the tests on one of them at 2 in the morning, and he decided to sleep overnight. I took his results this morning, sent them to the bin." Can you imagine, Marion? All that work, all that time, all those drugs wasted, and people had to wait. People who came in by ambulance with something serious. I'm the only one in the lab at night. And I'm stretched thin. "Yes, I understand," Kimberly Nurse Marion answered her. "But you can't just leave them in the street. They're people." To which Kimberly only grimaced. And it was understood that homeless people were not people, but the dregs of society. Marion had dreamed of becoming a doctor since childhood. True, at a very tender age, a veterinarian. The dream did not come from nothing. During the holidays, she lived with her grandparents in a wooden house, so the presence of a variety of pets in the dwelling was commonplace. The house was not far from a small forest, and her grandfather often brought home an injured hedgehog or a trapped fox. He treated the forest guests. Marion helped, and in the spring she watched as they were released into the forest. As Marion grew older, she realized she wanted to help people too. She decided it was better to be a good nurse than a mediocre doctor. She didn't bother going to college. She graduated from medical school with honors and almost immediately went to work in a municipal hospital, although she was called to a private clinic. And she even agreed to the director's offer. But she worked there for exactly 1 week, and the case was like this. One day the lights went off in the medical center just at the moment when the lab technicians were working on the analyses. Some of them were taken by patients with suspected cancer. Of course, everything had to be redone. The undone ones thrown out and apologized to people, and blood, smears, and so on had to be taken again. But at the hospital's expense, of course. What happened next shocked Marion. The lights came back on after 15 minutes. 2 lab assistants had already collected the spoiled test tubes to throw them away. But the head doctor literally burst into the lab. "What are you doing, you stupid fools? You cows are crazy," shouted Mr. Jonathan to the nurses. "We're writing hospital averages on the labs. I'm not going to pay out of my own pocket for rich people who don't have cancer. They have nowhere else to put their money." Marion's eyes widened. "Are you serious? What if there is cancer?" Who the hell are you anyway? What are you doing in the lab? I'm a new nurse, but I'm on my way out. I'll tell the press how you do your tests and how you treat your patients. You'll see that you'll have fewer rich people. The girl blurted out and left the office, slamming the door. You wretch, she heard in her wake. As a result, for a week's work she was not calculated, explaining that Marion also owed for allegedly broken ampoules with expensive medicine, and let her thank them for giving her a new labor card without a record and letting her go without an article. The girl did get in touch with journalists, but she faced a cold wall. When the media representatives learnt the name of the owner of the clinic, at first she did not understand anything, but then her mother, who worked in advertising, quickly explained everything to her. Marion, darling, I have to disappoint you, Mrs. Gwen said. This man sponsors half of the city's projects from the mayor's office and funds our newspapers every month. That's why no one will publish dirt on him. Our town is small. Everyone wants to eat not only dry bread, but butter and cheese. If not for themselves, then for their children. Do you understand? No, Mum, I don't. He's doing terrible things. It's a crime. I agree. But this should be handled not by young medical school graduates, but by adult operatives and representatives of the prosecutor's office. Don't worry, I'll meet the right people and pass on the information. This clinic will be investigated. Really? Really? Where are you going now? I can make a deal. No, Mum, you don't have to negotiate. I can do this on my own. I won't get any experience otherwise. I'll go to an ordinary clinic for ordinary people. Why else did I choose to be a doctor? All right. I don't mind, dear. Mrs. Gwen stroked her daughter's head. As a child, they called Marion Curly because of her long curly hair. The girl's large curls were bright brown in color. Combined with a small nose, bow lips, and turquoise-colored eyes, she looked like an angel. However, her mischievous nature and incredible energy rather quickly turned her into an elemental, though not a bringer of misfortune and destruction. With age, Marion, or Mary, as her family began to call her, turned into a beautiful girl with an active life position. The next day, Marion came to the personnel department of the medical unit number 4, and she was immediately sent for an interview with the head nurse. The latter, seeing a red diploma and a sane future employee, was very pleased and immediately sent her for registration. Medical personnel in public hospitals and polyclinics was severely lacking, despite the fact that their city was considered a student center in Kansas with one of the best medical schools in the country, graduates of which magically disappeared. Every year, 250 people disappeared each year, as if they were in a scary house. Marion, experienced doctors with long experience, explained this phenomenon in different ways. For example, with regard to surgeons, the deputy chief physician, Mr. Addison, with whom Marion became friends, and in this hospital she worked for the second year, said the following. You see, Marion, when yesterday's schoolboys first go to medical school, they have little idea of what they will have to face in practice. This is especially true of surgeons. The narrow specialization begins in the 3rd year, and practice only after graduation, when, having got to the state polyclinic and hospital, they see a real situation, not invented. The romantic fog dissipates. Overloaded with patients, the inability to earn decent money without exhausting labor, fighting everyday life, and sometimes the awareness of their own powerlessness. And that's the worst part. Why powerlessness? A doctor is not God. He can't do everything. And that's okay. That's true. But that's not what I'm saying. The system sometimes ruins everything, and you'll realize that soon enough. A few years ago, when you were still just studying, in our city introduced an experimental system when the money followed the patient. That is, a person came to the hospital, he was treated, and the bill for this care was paid by the insurance company that issued the policy. Each polyclinic has its own agreements with insurers. Since our region was the first, no one had really mastered this innovation yet. The result was the same as always and even worse. People came to their polyclinic, to which they were attached at their place of residence, in order to get, for example, a referral to another medical center for an ultrasound examination of the kidneys or stomach. Since their own polyclinic did not have the appropriate equipment. And what did they do? Gave them this referral, offering them help in their own clinic. At the same time, the patient was to be examined not by a specialized specialist who could help treat his disease, but, say, by an ordinary general practitioner. The money, as I have already said, went to the patient. And if everyone scattered to other polyclinics, what would the insurance company and the head doctor of a particular hospital get? As a result, people just died sitting in horrible queues or paid bribes to get this referral. And what all this ended up with was learnt in New York. The inspections began. The then head of regional healthcare was summoned to the carpet. And when he returned home after the rubbish in the capital, he died a few days later of a heart attack. So much for the system. It is clear that those doctors who did not give people referrals to the right specialist in other clinics in order not to lose money did not act independently. And even the head doctor, most likely, was not always involved. Although the management of polyclinics, of course, could not be unaware of this mess, but they could not go against the higher management either. It could, the girl answered very seriously. A person always has a choice. Another question is that something would have to be sacrificed for such an approach. And were these head doctors ready to make such a sacrifice for the sake of people's health or not? Marion, you're being too harsh. They all have children, families to feed, responsibilities to their loved ones. It's one person who can go into seclusion and learn the meaning of life. I don't know, but I prefer the phrase, do what you have to do, and there will be what happens if some doors close, others are bound to open, and then. Maybe it was a test of a higher power. But, Mr. Addison, it's almost like a fairy tale. Go left and you lose your horse, go right and you lose your life. But straight is straight. Mr. Addison smiled and poured Marion more coffee. In her second year of work, Marion realized what her senior comrade meant. The marginalized members of society were being brought in and out that day. It had turned sharply colder outside, and the frostbitten men and women, stunned by exhilarating substances, had nowhere to be placed, only to be placed, only to be sat down and not laid down. But it was a man in a dirty jacket and similar jeans that caught Marion's attention. He was half lounging on a sofa in the reception area, throwing back the long dark hair that covered his face. Marion stepped closer and saw that the man was young, no more than 27, and handsome, only somewhat haggard. He opened his eyes and Marion was struck by their incredible blue color. "Help," he whispered with just his lips. "I have diabetes. I need a shot of insulin urgently. I'm in your queue here and I won't live long enough to see a doctor." "Give me your passport. Do you have an insurance policy?" "What's your name?" Marion asked, confused, and took his hand to check his pulse. And immediately noticed that the young man had very well-groomed hands with a manicure, obviously made recently. That's a strange-looking tramp. If he is a tramp, of course, she thought. "My name is Brian, and I don't have any ID. I passed out in the street. My sugar must have dropped. I got really hungry, and then I got dizzy. And that was it. I don't remember how I got here. I had a bag with money, documents, phone, laptop, and insulin with a syringe. I always carry that with me. Wait a minute. I'd like to see your passport in your jacket pocket, please." "Yes, now, but you take it off," asked Marion. She helped the strange young man up and took off his jacket. Brian's reaction was unexpected. "Wait a minute, but that's not my jacket. What are these rags?" He lowered his head and stared at his jeans and tattered trainers. The man wasn't wearing socks at all. "Those things aren't mine either. Look, I've been stripped, it turns out." And to avoid attracting the attention of passers-by who might call the police to a naked man lying on a bench, they put this old stuff on me. So how long was I lying there? He didn't get a chance to finish. The boy began to shake, sweat dripped down his face, and he lost consciousness again. Marion did not bother with the origin of his rags and the identity of the patient, but galloped to the head nurse, Annie. I need an ampoule of insulin now. Only the patient hadn't been processed yet, tests hadn't been taken, and he had no ID. Annie took off her glasses and stared at the girl. What do you mean, no paperwork? And the policy, how are we going to take him in? We're not even an ambulance, we can only put him in for money. We have to report back later, said Annie. A person with type 1 diabetes needs multiple injections of insulin. And once is not enough, because the increase in blood glucose during the day and the peak of maximum sugar, which reduces the effect of insulin, may not always coincide in time and severity of the effect. Therefore, a lot of it is needed. In this case, most of the drug should be injected necessarily in the morning, and the rest in the evening before dinner. But my dear, only one ampoule costs $50. Suppose now I can pay for this poor man's medicine out of my own pocket. But then what? We'll have to put him down. We can't just throw the patient out on the street. That means it would cost about $6 a day, in addition to other procedures and drugs. Where are we going to get that? Then Annie might not be here, Marion said. He'll die if we don't give him an injection now. The head nurse was silent for a moment, then pulled out the keys to the drug stores. Let's go under my responsibility. 5 minutes later, they were in the basement. Annie went straight to the right rack, took 3 boxes of insulin and some syringes. Why so many? Marion asked afterwards. I'll tell you all about it later. Let's go quickly. They almost ran down the corridor to the waiting room where the strange guy Brian was lying. Marion quickly gave him an injection, and he began to come round. In the meantime, Annie had disappeared somewhere and appeared already dressed. I called a taxi. I'm taking the lad back to my house. He can't stay here. Do you live with your parents? You're going to have to answer a lot of questions. I've been living alone for a long time. Besides, I'm off duty. I've got my meds for the first few days, and then we'll see. Annie, you're going to get fired. I'm not afraid of being sacked. I'll get a job. But you're a pensioner. It's hard for you to go out, isn't it? That's right, a pensioner. I have a good pension. Plus my kids send me money every month. They're successful. They manage to stay in the capital. They both live well, earn money. Alex has his own business. All right, Marion, we're off. Help me take your godson to the taxi. He's a tall, big bloke, said Annie. Come and see me after your shift. I've sent you the address. We'll talk about what to do about the drugs we stole. Yes, Annie, of course I will. The tour of duty went relatively smoothly, and there were no further adventures. A thunderstorm broke out the morning after the medication reports were due. By law, not only the written version had to be handed in, but also the used ampoules after injections. Of course, it was impossible to use 3 packs of expensive insulin overnight, unless the entire diabetic ward from some other hospital was suddenly brought to the nursing unit at the same time. For some reason, all the nurses on duty for the past 24 hours were called. Girls, we have a very unpleasant situation, the head doctor Vanessa said, scanning the eyes of her subordinates. We have 3 packs of insulin missing. Doesn't anyone want to tell me anything? Yes, without waiting for the confusion in the team, the air raid and possible search of innocent colleagues' belongings, Marion answered. I took the medication, Vanessa. Don't ask me why or why not. I still won't say. If you're going to make a criminal case, you'll tell me. If you don't, I'll write a letter of resignation. The doctor was silent for a long time. She was an intelligent and experienced woman, a professional doctor and a good manager of this medical center for 10 years. During these years, she had seen a lot of things and different staff members. and she understood that this girl, who had worked for them for less than 2 years, was anything but a thief or a drug addict. Marion didn't think about the fact that she was out of work. Youth is often careless, and besides, she was not an orphan and did not die of hunger. After all, you can go to the carers in some private office. There are plenty of them in the city, and they pay quite well, not like in the budget medical center. Vanessa pulled a pack of thin cigarettes from the table and smoked nervously. She suddenly remembered the story of her family and her own unhappy, tragic love. Vanessa was already 100% sure that feelings were involved. She had seen Marion's eyes, in which flashed dreaminess and firefly, and the first signs of heartbreak from the little rascals Cupid and his older brother Cupid. Vanessa was born in New York to a family of hereditary doctors. They immigrated from Russia before the collapse of the USSR. With such a surname because of the fifth point, there were problems time and again. And her grandmother fell under the repressions of '51, becoming a defendant in the doctor's case. Interrogations and bullying began. Young therapist Maggie, Vanessa's grandmother, could not avoid them. She remembered her tormentor warden Matthew Green for the rest of her life. From his ascetic surname, the young sadist had nothing in his appearance or character. Some pathologically perfect beauty was combined with animal cruelty. He came to Maggie every night and forced her to do things that long afterwards in her dreams made her scream and beg for mercy. How she was able to get pregnant after that and give birth to Vanessa's mother is a mystery. In March 1953, the case of the doctors ended automatically. All the accused were acquitted. But how can one forget those terrible 2 years? Maggie remembered them for the rest of her long life. They say that we have all lived once before, and those who torment us in this life suffered from us in the past. God knows if that's true or not, but the Matthew Green family became a real curse on the family. In time, Maggie came to her senses, married and had a daughter, Monica, in 1958, and Monica in 1982. Vanessa, or Radu as she was called at home. Immediately after high school, she went to medical school, med school. And in 2008, she fell in love. A young man named Sebastian was well-built, educated, a native New Yorker from a wealthy family. Graduated from law school. He liked Vanessa too. They dated for a year before they decided to introduce their families and announce their upcoming wedding. Rada was 2 months pregnant. A cafe was bought and relatives were invited. Maggie's mom, dad, and grandma came first. Everyone was looking forward to the celebration. And then the groom's family came in. Everyone sat down at the table, and suddenly Vanessa and her parents heard some kind of eerie sigh. They turned to Maggie and saw that she was pale as a sheet, wheezing and sliding off the chair. Vanessa rushed to her aid, but when she turned to Sebastian to tell him to call an ambulance, she saw another strange thing, a very elderly but still handsome man. Smiling crookedly, pale as chalk, he was almost jogging out of the hall. Behind him, there was no time for that. They waited for the doctors and left with their grandmother for the hospital. Maggie regained consciousness the next day. A stroke had been ruled out. She opened her eyes and saw Vanessa sitting next to her. "Vanessa, baby, what's your fiancé's last name?" "I never asked you," she asked hoarsely. "There was no need, Grandma. Sebastian has a rare surname, an unusual Green. Which means I'm not wrong, unfortunately." "Vanessa, you can't marry him," Granny said. "Why not?" "Because I'm 2 months pregnant. I'm not getting rid of a baby, and I'm not getting rid of my firstborn." "What are you talking about? You're a doctor." "I don't understand you at all." "I can't tell you everything yet, baby. You go home and tell Monica to come to me." "Yes, Grandma. Of course, Mummy was with you all night. I changed her this morning. She's asleep and she'll come." Maggie closed her eyes. Despite her 87 years of age and the trials of her youth, she had a sober mind, strong nerves, and good health. Genetics had never been canceled, but for the first time in her life she didn't know what to do. how to tell Vanessa about all this. It wasn't her and Sebastian's fault, but it was genetics. And Maggie was sure that the grandfather of her granddaughter's fiancé was mentally unhealthy, a sadist, a real maniac. What if Vanessa has a boy who inherits his grandfather's proclivity? After all, abnormalities, like genius, are often passed down through generations. And then, how will she be able to communicate with the family of the man who tried to hurt and abuse her? With unanswered questions, Maggie fell asleep by morning. The decision had matured. She decided to tell her daughter and granddaughter everything. After all, Vanessa had to know what kind of family she was about to enter. But man presumes and God disposes. In the morning, Vanessa arrived at her grandmother's house at noon. She was extremely excited. "Grandmother, hello. Well, we'll never get married to Sebastian," she said. "Can you believe it? His grandfather, Matthew Green, hanged himself. That's almost 90 years old. He was a decorated policeman and all that. I still can't believe it. He hanged himself." Maggie couldn't believe her ears. "Did he leave a note?" she asked. "He did, but it wasn't very interesting. Just, 'I'm sorry for everything.'" "I see," Maggie said, though she didn't really understand why Matthew Green, a sadistic criminal, had suddenly decided to take his own life in his old age. Was he afraid of something? Even if she dared to tell Sebastian, or worse, the journalists, no one would believe her. They would have thought that the grandmother, or crazy in her 87 years, or decided to make money on the sensation, to embarrass a wealthy man in today's time, and honored artists are not bent on creating fake sensations for the sake of hype or money. So this option would not surprise anyone. Another question is that if she, Maggie, has not told anyone anything until today, what is the point of doing it before the wedding of her granddaughter? And yet the elder Green was so scared of something that leaving his life was the only possible way out for him. God works in mysterious ways. Soon Monica arrived. She began to torture her mother about what she was going to tell her, but she decided to keep silent for the time being. As time went on, she did the right thing. A week later, Vanessa slipped near the house, fell and hit her back hard. The baby wasn't saved. Perhaps there was some kind of divine providence in it. A month later, Sebastian married another girl. His father had a big business in the US. She lost her head for the guy. The one reflected that by marrying, albeit an ugly but very rich girl with solid accounts in foreign banks, he would have everything much faster than with his labors in his homeland. Love? Well, love, he thought. What was it that King Solomon used to say? All things pass, and this too shall pass. And by maturity, it won't be very important at all. Much scarier to stay at 40 years old with empty hands, with a one-room flat inherited or unpaid mortgage, and a belly from poor diet and inability to attend a good gym with his wife. Here it will not be to love. The hemorrhoids would be cured at public expense. 40 days after the death of his beloved grandfather, they quietly signed with his new bride and flew to San Francisco. Vanessa terribly experienced first the loss of a child, then the betrayal of her fiancé. She abandoned the institute, almost stopped eating, and lay with her face to the wall, listening to some depressive rock from morning till night. That's when Maggie told her. All that Vanessa heard, strangely enough, it brought the girl to her senses. She got drunk for the first time in her life then, and then somehow she calmed down dramatically, finished med school. Found an ad for an open position as a doctor in the state of Kansas in a county, and went to the state's county. As she told her family, to give herself back to herself, but she didn't want to come to New York and start over from scratch. Neither did she want to get into a personal relationship, although she was a very attractive woman and always had men hanging around her. Recently, she turned 35 years old, the prime of beauty and feminine strength. Vanessa smoked a cigarette and began to draw up an order for Marion's dismissal. Suddenly, her mobile phone rang, and the number of the head of the regional health department popped up. Vanessa was surprised and somewhat tense, although she didn't remember any offenses. She picked up the phone. "Vanessa," "Hello," said a familiar voice. "Good morning, Mr. Terrence. What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" "The mayor and his mate, Millionaire Oliver King, are coming to see you now. You know him. He owns factories, newspapers, steamships." "I know him. But why?" "God forgive me. They want to give money to the clinic. We can't do that. You know we're on national projects. And you can't even take gifts on a birthday. You'll be accused of corruption. For 3 old roses and a bottle of cognac." "Calm down. Oliver King has a son who's diabetic, insulin dependent. He collapsed on a bench yesterday afternoon, passed out in the center of town. Unfortunately, it all happened behind the university. There's not many passers-by there, and the students were in the middle of their classes. So some scoundrels stripped him, dressed him in their rags, and stole his bag with all his documents, gadgets, money, and insulin. Luckily, a couple in love were passing by. They called an ambulance. The guy's been brought to you. He should be at your place." On some subconscious level, Vanessa began to form a picture: 3 boxes of insulin missing from storage, Marion refusing to say why she'd stolen them. "Wait. They don't have a patient called King," Vanessa thought. She was personally checking the incoming patients. She couldn't sleep that night, and there was nothing to do at home alone, so she stayed the night in her office. And then everything fell into place. Vanessa had learnt well over the year the character of her nurse Marion and her commitment to the exploits in defense of all the outcasts. And if the guy is also good-looking, it makes sense. But why does she need 3 boxes of insulin? And where is this millionaire's son? "By the way, what's his name?" Vanessa asked. "Brian King. Born in 1986, Mr. Terrence replied. Blood type 2, Rh positive. Tall, well-built brunette. Looked like a real bum, though. No ID, no money. They brought him in like that. Yeah, well, at least yours didn't kill him. They could have just thrown him in the ward, taking him for a drug addict, if he was unconscious and hallucinating." "What are you saying?" Vanessa said quietly. "I'll call you back in exactly 10 minutes, and don't be nervous. I'm pretty sure everything's fine. And Brian King is fine." Vanessa had already put 2 and 2 together and realized that her staff really wouldn't have helped a patient like Brian King. But not because they were indifferent, but because of the wild workload of yesterday's ambulance and the inability to label Brian's own problem if he was nearly unconscious. Apparently, Marion had somehow managed to talk to him and, without waiting for permission from her superiors, had administered the insulin, realizing that time was running out in minutes and the guy would just die. But where did she take him? "No way. I didn't realize. It's not without our Annie." Vanessa slapped herself on the forehead. "And the 3 boxes? They took them because they didn't know how long it would take them to find the relatives of the rescued young man." Vanessa dialed the head nurse's mobile phone. "Yes," came Annie's cheerful voice. "I'll be right back. Bring your guest to us. I'll send a car right away. His parents have been found, Dad. In particular, it's the millionaire Oliver King. They're on their way over for the stolen insulin. Don't worry. And Marion, too. Just bring the rest of the ampoules." Okay, there was a pause, then a short exhalation, and finally we're sending him out. I just fed him. But how did you guess that the regional health center helped? And I'm not weak-minded myself, Vanessa grinned. Well, see you later and call Marion. Tell her to come back, smiled the head doctor and exhaled. She was very glad that she would not have to change her opinion about Marion and fire one of the best employees. Half an hour later, Annie and Marion brought Brian to the hospital, and half an hour later some important guests arrived. Brian looked, delighting everyone. He was able to shower at Annie's, eat, sleep, and get the right dose of his life-saving insulin. A tall man in his mid-50s walked into the doctor's office with quick strides, very similar to the overnight guest, Annie. He was also tall, handsome, and well-groomed. "Hi, Dad," Brian exclaimed. "I'm sorry, I don't know how I passed out in the street. I got the injections just in time." "What are you apologizing for, you what?" Dad asked. "Go on, get in the car and I'll talk to your saviors." "Wait," Brian said. "Come on, let's go out into the corridor." And the two kings walked out of the office. Dad said, "Brian," when they were alone, "I'd like you to invite this girl Marion to our house as a family nurse and my personal assistant. She's savvy and not afraid to take charge in critical situations. She should be a military doctor, and I think she can handle our grandmother. I made sure of that tonight. By the way, did you find the people who robbed me?" "We found them, and we traced them to the ambulance that took you away. They went to your laptop to turn it in, and there's a mountain of photos of us inside. The owner of the tech pawn shop private messaged me on Telegram. Lucky for me, I was online. Usually first the thing is taken to the pawn shop, then for 2 or 3 hours the seller waits for it. You don't know if it doesn't work or if it's worthless, and only then the money is given out if everything is in order. So when those bastards showed up for their fee, my guards were waiting for them. They showed me where they found you, but you were gone. So I called the ambulance and found out who was on duty the night before." "Thank God I didn't have to search my brains," Oliver King said and turned away from the window. "Dad, it's all right." "Brian Marion, you say?" He smiled and looked at his son carefully. "Is it the one with the curly hair, green eyes, and long eyelashes, or the one who is a pensioner with the face of a good sorceress?" "Oh, Daddy," exclaimed Brian. All right. The girl's really good and pretty. But will she want to come to us because she's proud, or am I not good at people? And will they let her leave the hospital?" "You talk to the head doctor. Let's give her money for something useful. Or give the nursing unit something. And we need to make a clever offer to Marion, so she won't be offended, won't think we're buying. And most importantly, she wouldn't say no." "Oh, Brian, you're not in love, are you?" Oliver grinned. "Well, to be honest," almost Brian replied. "Dad, will you help me?" "Get in the car. You're a lifesaver," Oliver said. "Of course I will." And the elder king headed back to Vanessa's office. Interestingly, it should be noted, he liked the head doctor, which didn't happen often. It had been 7 years since his wife Sharon had died, but Oliver hadn't met a woman he wanted to date, let alone marry. And then he was pushed. He and Sherry, as friends and family called her, had met when they were both in their early 20s, almost as old as Marion and Brian were now. It was the 80s, with all that entailed. The country was getting ready for a dramatic change. They weren't visible yet, but revolutionary moods were already in the air. But the guys were young, good-looking, in love with each other and with life. Despite everything, Oliver studied at medical school to become a pediatric surgeon, but even then he realized that supplying medical equipment and drugs was the future. He opened his first company's technical and commercial pharmacies, brought for sale lasers, humidifiers, tonometers, and so on. Oliver King began to unwind. They got married. Brian was born. Incredibly, Oliver managed to avoid conflicts with gangsters who obsessively offered their patronage. He didn't pay tribute, like most businessmen of the time in general. The fact is that before going into business, he saved the life of a young son of one of the criminal authorities. And it happened so distribution after institutes has already been abolished, but in medical institutes senior students were obliged to pass practice in medical centers of the city. Oliver got to the Children's Regional Hospital. He was brought kids from the village, and often in a neglected state. At night he was on duty. At 12 o'clock the doors of the hospital opened, and a young man literally ran in with a 3-year-old boy in his arms. The child was wheezing, gasping for breath. A dangerous blue color had already appeared around his lips. Two tall, stout men and a young woman ran after the man. Having flown past the guards, the group rushed to the first floor, where the resident's room and the chief physician's office were located. The latter had been gone for a long time. Mr. Davies had not only delayed the salaries of his staff, but some nurses with small children had to walk across town to work with the lights off. At the same time, the head doctor was skiing in Shirigesh, practically not appearing at his workplace. Oliver was alone in the resident's room at that hour. The door opened and a man with a child came in. "Hello. Where are your pediatricians, surgeons? Is there a doctor in charge? Help my son. He's been breathing like this for 4 hours. The ambulance, bitches, has not arrived." "I'm a surgeon," Oliver replied. He washed his hands, changed his clothes, dialed an intercom line for assistance and a nurse. He was almost certain that the child had croup and needed to be operated on immediately. Only the cause needed to be clarified. Was it a foreign body in the throat or a complication from the flu? He went to the examination room and examined the boy and realized that time was running out. If not by minutes, then not more than a couple of hours. "Prepare the operating theater immediately," he commanded. "Doctor, save my son," begged the boy's father, wiping the cold sweat from his face. "I won't be in your debt." "Young man, we'll do everything we can and more," Oliver King replied. "And you need to calm down and pull yourself together." "Are you the mother?" He turned to a frail woman with huge, tear-filled eyes. That was the year Sharon passed away. A blood clot broke. She didn't even feel a thing. The loss of a mother to her son was the trigger for the development of the disease. Sharon was the only daughter of her mother, Elizabeth. She raised her alone. After her death, the woman had to undergo several sessions with a psychologist. Oliver took his mother-in-law in. That's how the three of them lived for the last 7 years. Oliver King looked into Vanessa's office. The women were drinking coffee. They were entertained by Oliver's security guard, Jasper, the soul of the company and a charming favorite of the fair sex. Despite the fact that he was in his 6th decade, Jasper was in great physical shape. Jasper told them stories and anecdotes, and the ladies rolled with laughter. When he saw the chief, Jasper immediately turned serious, and with a nod to his partner, left the office. "All right," Oliver said, not going inside yet, and began to give instructions. "Jasper, go get flowers for the ladies according to their tastes. I'll tell them what bouquets to buy for the evening. Book a table at the restaurant. That's all for now. Lovely women, let me thank you for your son and invite you tonight to the best restaurant in our city to celebrate the fact that everything has come to a good end." "Are we really going to a restaurant?" Annie asked, smiling flirtatiously, glancing at Vanessa. "Yes," Oliver said. She was staring at her computer, pretending to be incredibly busy. In fact, for the umpteenth time that morning, she found herself thinking that she liked this Oliver King. For the first time in years. And it wasn't surprising. He was tall, dark-haired, and very good-looking, reminding her of a young Viggo Mortensen. By the way, fun fact, his mother named him so because of his love for the actor in 1967, when the film starring Viggo Mortensen was released. It was watched by 40 million people. And what happened after the premiere with women in the US? Everyone dreamed of finding a life partner, at least a little like Mortensen, played by Viggo Mortensen. Of course, and Edward Norton was very good himself, but still a little lost in this film, Viggo Mortensen. And what was his enchanting voice worth? "We'll be there. Goodbye, girls." Vanessa finally lifted her head from the screen and looked her black eyes straight into Oliver's eyes. "What time is the gathering?" she asked. 7 o'clock, Oliver King replied, keeping his son's blue gaze fixed on her. Marion watched silently, nodding, listening attentively to her superiors and to the father of the young man she had rescued. "Is Brian coming?" "You're not enough for the three of us," she asked with a serious look. "Certainly," said the elder king in her tone of voice. "We'll invite Jasper, too. He's a real charmer, in spite of his age." "How old is he?" Annie, the young pensioner, was now interested. "How old? How old?" all the people in the room asked in unison. "He is a sportsman, a retired officer, a military doctor. He's fought in almost every hot spot. He also sings, waltzes, and embroiders." Oliver looked meaningfully at Annie, and Annie gawked. The women scattered to the shops and hairdressers. The men went home. Vanessa gave instructions to the staff and for the first time in many years went to tidy up. The restaurant Marseille opened in the early 90s and all these years held the brand of the best place in the city. If we talk about the city in France, in honor of which the owner of the restaurant named it, it is the most ancient and multinational city of France, where French, Italians, Spaniards, Arabs and Corsicans live. That's why the cuisine here is the most diverse. Almost everyone came, only Vanessa was missing. She was late. Suddenly, the male half of the room sighed. Participants of the party raised their heads and also aghast. An absolutely incredible woman had entered the hall, and it was Vanessa. She was wearing a floor-length dress in the color of dark red wine, encircling a luxurious figure, a garnet necklace and the same earrings, and her black as tar hair was arranged in a high hairstyle. She approached the table and smiled. Oliver was speechless. The evening had gone beautifully. Everyone had found a date. Jasper was flirting with Annie, Brian was chatting with Marion, Oliver and Vanessa were nothing to speak of. Finally, the elder king chose the moment to make Marion an offer she couldn't refuse. "Marion, we have a proposition for you," he said. "Brian and our grandmother need a personal nurse who can always help. Would you be willing to work for us and live on our property? We have a big, comfortable house in the country, a garden, a swimming pool." "You'll be happy with the salary," Oliver added abruptly. "I don't know." Marion answered confusedly and looked at Vanessa. "Go for it," she nodded. "If you want, you can take a month's leave. If everything goes well, you can quit later or come back." Vanessa smiled. And thus began Marion's new life. Of course, she informed her parents. The only thing she didn't tell them was that she was having an affair with Brian, so that, as they say, they wouldn't get excited. She liked the house. There was no flashy luxury, as in many rich homes. Everything made sense and was intended for the comfort of its inhabitants, not for image. She had quickly hit it off with Oliver's mother-in-law and Brian's maternal grandmother, Mrs. Beatrice. Despite her advanced age, she asked to be called just Beatrice. "It makes me feel younger," she explained. It was not for nothing that Lucille Ball asked to be called Lucy. She was a bitch, but she was smart. How am I any worse than Lucille Ball? "I can sing a song or two, by the way," Grandma said cheerfully. She told Marion endless stories from her youth, and she listened without interrupting. Then one day she suggested that Beatrice record them all on a tape recorder so that she could write a book. Beatrice was very happy, and they got on with it. With Brian, the romance developed rapidly. Of course, they tried not to advertise the relationship, although Brian's father did not object to it. On this day, Marion got up very early. She had a lot of errands and trips around the city planned. She didn't take a driver, but set off on foot. She wanted to go for a walk. Winter had just begun, and this year it was warm. Fluffy, almost Christmas-like snow fell from the sky. "Young lady, can I talk to you for a moment?" Suddenly, the car door opened next to her, and a young smiling man of pleasant appearance stepped out of it. "Can you help me? I'm not from around here. I can't find my brother's house." And the navigator's broken. As it happens. "Yes, of course. What's the address?" Marion asked. 15 Lenox Street. "That's very near." "Are you opposite this house?" Marion exclaimed and fainted, feeling a smell and a rag near her face. She woke up in a wooden house with her hands and feet bound. Opposite her on a stool sat the same young man, only he was no longer smiling. He looked at her silently and smoked. "Are you awake?" "That's fine," he said. "Hi, don't interrupt me. I'll explain everything. I'm going to call your Brian and let him know I have you. He needs to bring me $2 million and I'll let you go." "Why not euros?" Marion wondered. "Why $2 million? No more and no less. It's enough to operate on my child. And if it is not done in the next fortnight, my daughter will die. That's it." Marion was dumbfounded. Then she said, "What's your name? Tell me everything. I'll help you find the money or the opportunity to do the operation. Untie me, yelling and running away, I will not run away. Also, if you extort money from the kings, you'll lose. They've got their own security detail and the mayor's a friend. And the mayor's a former 90s big shot. If you've lived in the city long enough, you know that. It's a no-brainer. How did you come up with this? And why me?" "I'm nobody to them," Marion wondered. "I didn't really think of it," said Jasper, reassuring Marion. "My name is Jasper. And as for the idea of kidnapping, I didn't have time for that. Why you and not Brian? He has an insulin-dependent form of diabetes. I'm aware of that. How would I take him hostage? My daughter's dying. I'm not a scumbag." Marion sat down. "Okay, I'll put the coffee on." "I've been here a long time," she said, and looked at her watch. "I need to make a phone call. I'll be missed soon. Where's my stuff?" "The bag." Jasper handed Marion her purse. She took out her phone and dialed a number. "Beatrice, hi. I ran into an old mate of mine by chance. She's been living in Italy for a long time, married to a local, and came to visit her parents for a week. We haven't seen each other for ages. We'll sit in a cafe for a while, chat, so you don't lose me. I'll be back tonight. I've given Brian his injection, and in the morning I've prepared some porridge with berries and pancakes and cottage cheese for him in the kitchen under a napkin." "And you'll eat too, baby, don't worry," replied Brian's grandmother in the voice of Faina Ranevskaya. "Don't worry," Marion mocked. She, by the way, both her manner and her favorite jokes were from Faina's piggy bank. "This isn't a room, it's a well. I feel like a bucket that has been lowered down there," she quoted Oliver King when he solemnly opened the doors of her new office. Yes, Brian's grandmother had her own study. Beatrice wrote memoirs, short stories, and fairy tales for adults. She also smoked a pipe, almost like a famous actor's grandmother, and swore. As for drinks, she respected only high-quality moonshine, which she herself had brewed in the huge kitchen of the Kings. Oliver treated her hobby calmly. Firstly, he was quite sure in moonshine, and secondly, he liked to have a drink or two himself. His business had already been established and built. He only controlled the process, having recruited the management of departments from his trusted circle, with whom he had gone through fire, water, and the most difficult situations. That is for glory. At the same time, Beatrice had an aristocratic appearance, tall, still very slender, with a mop of thick hair, which she always dyed in platinum color, correct facial features, and a thin nose with a hunchback. But what had won the heart of former Lieutenant Colonel Jasper? Annie, in his spare time from guarding Oliver King, Jasper invited to theaters and cafes, and once she said that she wanted to visit a nightclub. "Annie, you wouldn't like it there, I'm sure," Jasper said. "Why not?" "Because an intelligent woman with a high intellect, education, a great sense of humor, and good taste can't like it." "If all of those things were true, I'd call you Daddy," Annie retorted. "But anyway, tonight we're going to that den of debauchery. At least at 60, I should be able to commit a sin, shouldn't I?" And off they went. The night bar Tamerlan met them with creativity, illumination, and smoke. The guards at the entrance looked at the atypical visitors with surprise. Alcohol, drugs, and other prohibited substances are not allowed. But I think you know, said one of them. Oh, young man, I brought it by accident. I didn't know, Annie said, and pulled a huge piece of lard out of her purse. The boys stared at first and then laughed out loud. Jasper laughed too, who was used to his friend's antics, but he hadn't expected this. But seriously, guys, this is a treat from me. I suppose you're tired of standing here till morning. Take it. She handed the lard to the guards. They smiled, subdued by the unusual gesture. They thanked Annie and took the gift. If they offend, you tell us at once, they said. Colleagues, no offense will be taken. We'll manage on our own, Jasper retorted. You're in security, too. Yes, I shouldn't have realized. You're either military or security, said one of the guys. I'm both, said Jasper. Come on, let's go. They were met by the Ramstein. It was stuffy, and there was no way to talk because of the infernal volume of the music. After 15 minutes, they had already gone to the bar, where it was quiet and hardly any tunes could be heard. Annie, are we going out again tomorrow? Jasper asked cheerfully after they had been sitting at the bar for a couple of hours. Fantastic, she said. Although, perhaps, next time on the performance of songs of the band Kiss will be the best. Robert Johnson raised his daughter Linda alone. With her mother Rachel, he met not in the theater, not in the library, or even on the street. He booked her services. Rachel was pursuing a career as a call girl when they met in the course of her professional duties. The young people suddenly got to talking. And the girl did not complain about life, did not tell sad stories about an alcoholic mother or a mean fiancé. No, she honestly said that she liked this way of life, liked the money she received and the freedom of choice. And she was getting a very good deal. They started dating. And 6 months later, Rachel got pregnant. She decided to keep the baby because she was already 27, and with her lifestyle, she was unlikely to get another chance. She had no doubt that Robert was the father of the child she had had unprotected intercourse with him just 6 months ago. They had had too much to drink. The girl was in good standing in her office, and she was given maternity leave. But Rachel died in labor from blood loss. Something went wrong, and the surgeons couldn't stop the bleeding. To take the girl from the maternity hospital, Robert helped Rachel's colleagues. It is no secret that in criminal structures a lot of useful acquaintances and connections, especially in the business of providing intimate services. Many high-ranking people used them. The daughter was temporarily taken by Robert's parents, and he went to Alaska. He earned well and almost all the money he sent to his parents, leaving himself only to pay for housing, food, and clothes. Getting married somehow didn't work out. He did not go to nightclubs. At work he was very tired and got used to non-private, non-committal relationships. When Linda was 2 years old, he returned from a shift and got a good job in the city. The girl grew up a quiet, sunny child. When she went to school, she studied well, got along with both teachers and classmates. But when she was 15 years old, there was a misfortune. Linda fainted right at the lesson of Russian language. Teachers thought that the girl just overexcited or tired, but of course they called an ambulance. Linda stayed in the hospital for a while. After her tests, the doctors gave a terrible verdict: blood cancer. The first reaction to the news was not even shock, but rage. Robert's parents and he himself decided that the doctors had made a mistake, mixed up the analyses. It could not be that a young girl who had not yet entered into life turned out to have such a disease. Why? She was barely born when she lost her mother. She hardly saw her father because he was always busy earning a living. She didn't even have time to fall in love. Unfortunately, the diagnosis was confirmed, and at the dispensary where they were sent, all hell broke loose. Chemotherapy, mountains of drugs, endless hospital walls. In the end, the attending doctor said that Linda needed an emergency bone marrow transplant. Robert was a suitable donor, but there was no quota for the operation in the near future, and they couldn't wait. And then the man decided to take this wild step to kidnap a man from a rich family and demand a ransom for him. He spent a long time monitoring information about wealthy citizens, their children and relatives. The paparazzi spotted the King family in the restaurant Marseille when Oliver and the women were there. They also got wind of Marion and Brian's affair and colorfully described it. It went viral. That's how Robert knew he had to kidnap Marion. Firstly, the girl was a doctor, and therefore had strong nerves and logic, and secondly, was not a child, which greatly relieved the conscience of the kidnapper. He was not going to harm his hostage, let alone kill her. "Yes, the situation is not easy," said Marion, having listened to Robert's story. "Where is Linda now?" "In the dispensary, though she is hardly treated, just to keep her alive." "Where do you plan to do the operation?" "If the money is available, in Moscow." "Come on, let's go." "Where to?" "To the King's." "Where else?" "Didn't you say you were going to ask them for my ransom?" "You'll get it now." "But I'm still." "You is still." "Are you uncomfortable? 4 hours ago, you were willing to go to jail to get money, and you were right in your own way. Now he's uncomfortable. You don't have a choice. Besides, I'm the one who's going to do the talking and ask for the money." "Yeah, you're right, of course." On their way to town, a real spectacle was playing out in front of the number 4 medical center. The sick were stuck to the windows, and the staff who had a spare moment were pouring out into the street. A real gypsy ensemble with guitars, violins, and of course soloists had set up under the windows. They sang romantic, and Brian told the young man's story. Oliver listened to his son and remembered how he had almost lost him 3 months ago. What had not changed his mind during that terrible night when Brian did not call back and then became unavailable. "Of course, son will help. I'll get Walter on the phone, see if he can work out a quota. If not, we'll send Robert and his daughter to Moscow. We'll wire the money for the operation right away. It's not a problem at all. The main thing is that this operation will help. By the way, I've seen him somewhere before, but I can't remember where." "Where have you seen him, Oliver?" "Jasper just appeared out of nowhere behind him." "That's my lieutenant. We came back from Syria together once, came to apply for a job with you. But Robert changed his mind and went to Alaska to work. He thought it would pay better." "How? You fought together? Then all the more reason to help." So he dialed the number of the mayor and former criminal mastermind, Walter. "Walter, hi. Here's the deal. I need to help a good man," Oliver said. "When can he and I meet you tomorrow?" "Great. I'll see you tomorrow." Robert was in the kitchen when Jasper walked in. When he saw him, he put his mug on the table and started to get up. "Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, it can't be." "Yes, it can. Well, hello, Lieutenant Robert Johnson." Robert was left overnight in the house, and they spent the whole night talking with Jasper over a bottle of brandy, remembering the living and remembering the dead. In the morning, they went with Oliver to the town hall to see Walter. He listened attentively and started making calls in front of them. "Guys, are there really any quotas available?" "Not at the moment. But I'll help with the money." "No, Alex, I'll give you the money. You're under a microscope right now. There's a fight against corruption, so the guilty and the right are both being brought to justice." 3 days later, Robert and his daughter flew to New York. They were already waiting for them there. The operation was a success. Linda had a good chance of permanent remission. She was already smiling, a blush appeared on her cheeks, and her appetite had returned. Robert stayed with his daughter, telling her stories, and later the doctors allowed her to watch films and use the computer. Oliver subsidized Robert not by 2 million, but more. It was only fair to point out that in New York you had to live on something, eat something, and there were few unforeseen expenses. In 2 months they were promised to be discharged. In the meantime, the Kings were preparing to marry 2 people at once. Brian proposed to Marion, and she, of course, accepted. But before that, the occupants of the mansion had to endure another event. On Saturday morning, waking up, Oliver decided to go out into the yard to brush the snow, to breathe the frosty fresh air. He stretched, straightened his shoulders, and suddenly there was some sort of growl or roar behind him. When he turned round, he almost turned gray. The gate was open, and behind it stood a small-sized lynx. The wild cat and Oliver looked at each other in silence. Then the spotted guest entered the courtyard and yawned with all his formidable maw. There was no escape, and Oliver didn't know what to do. The only consolation was the fact that it was clearly not an adult cat, but a teenager. After 5 minutes, fortunately, the situation resolved itself. Following the teenage lynx, a skinny girl with a leash literally flew into the yard. Mars ran away. "And where's that sneaky bastard?" she exclaimed. "Curious." "May." "Don't worry, he won't hurt you." We came from the circus and stopped at a shop to buy some water. And Mars was in the car. He must have opened the door with his paw and got out. But how did he open the gate? The owner explained, putting the harness on him at the same time. Oliver exhaled, and after him all the family stuck to the large window, not knowing how to help Oliver in such a non-trivial situation. In 3 minutes, Beatrice and Marion were outside, scratching Oliver's ears and neck with the permission of his owner. He rumbled, squinted his eyes, and growled softly. "What circus are you from?" Marion asked. "New York. We are neighbors with you. Mars is not wild, he was born here. But his mum Silva is a serious animal. If she came in here, God forbid, it'd be a big deal. And you come to our performances, I'll give you invitations as moral compensation." And she took Mars and went to the car. 2 minutes later, she returned with the invitations. "Thank you," thanked Marion, and the creative couple said goodbye and left. As they walked out, they bumped into Brian. "Oh my God, what is this? We're going to have a homeless girl living with a forest cat." "I don't mind," he said with a laugh. Marion hung on to Brian, laughing. Oliver looked at them and realized that he had done everything right in life. Otherwise, things would be different for him now. After all, children get bonuses from fate, not only for the sins of their parents, but also for their good deeds. A week later, Marcel was celebrating 2 weddings at once. The Kings had fully rented the restaurant. In the middle of the celebration, when Caroline came to pick up her daughter at the daycare center, she froze when she saw an exact replica of her missing son. And running up to him, in P4. The frowning sky illuminated the room with its whiteness when a young girl, who looked to be about 25 years old, opened the thick blue curtains. Instantly the room became alive, filled with the pleasant atmosphere of the morning. A happy smile shone on her face. "Adrian, get up," she said affectionately, and the boy of about 5, who was lying in his cot, rose unhappily and awkwardly wiped his eyes. "Mum," he mumbled in a thin, childish voice, "5 more minutes." "Not 5 more minutes. Come on, get up. I'm going to wake Ariel up again. Daddy's taking you to daycare. Is that where you sleep during quiet time? Come on, get up." Caroline, the young mother's name, decided to wake up her children Adrian and Ariel early today. Their father Benjamin Willis was also awake and ready to take the kids to kindergarten. All that was left was to wake them up and get them ready. The children of the young family have always been obedient, well-mannered, and disciplined. Adrian, who had just turned 5 2 months ago, was smart and quiet. He almost always obeyed his mum and dad unconditionally, because they were always explaining to the children that they only wanted the best for them. In his 5 years, he could realize that his parents had lived longer than he had, and that listening to them was very important to himself. His little sister Ariel, who was about to turn 4, didn't realize this yet. But she loved her big brother very much and looked up to him, and tried to learn this trait from him. She did not understand why she had to get up so early, or why she had to eat porridge for breakfast. But when she saw her brother doing these things without further ado, she repeated after him. But as it usually happens, sometimes even the most solid and well-established mechanisms failed. And this morning, for some reason, Adrian couldn't get out of bed. "Come on, I'll give you 5 minutes to wake up," Caroline commanded with a smile and, leaving the room, added, "I'm going to go wake Ariel up." Caroline and Benjamin tried to raise their children to be disciplined, but never succumbed to that very parental dictatorship. They tried to talk to their children as equals and prove to them the usefulness of their advice, not by birching or standing in the corner, but by words. But they did not give full freedom to choose whether to obey their parents or not. If a child refused to obey, which rarely happened, they would give him an explanatory talk. When Caroline entered the room, she opened the thick curtains, which were pink in her daughter's room, and tapped her on the shoulder. "Daughter, get up. It's time for daycare," she said. Ariel immediately opened her eyes and looked at her mum sleepily. "Is Adrian up?" she asked in a voice that was even thinner than Adrian's own. "Yes, he's awake," Caroline said softly and smiled. "You wake up too, and Daddy will take you to daycare." Ariel obeyed and immediately got up on the bed, wiping her sleepy eyes. The children slept separately from each other and from their parents, and when her daughter then left her room for the living room, and the door to her son's room wasn't even ajar, Caroline suspected something. She went into Adrian's room again. "Adrian," she tapped him lightly on the shoulder, "wake up. Daddy is already waiting for you." The son lifted his head on the bed, barely opening his eyes, looked at his mum, and asked in a very sleepy voice, "Has it been 5 minutes already?" "Well, it's been 10, Caroline exclaimed, and stepped away from the bed. Sighing heavily, the 5-year-old boy sat up on the bed. "I'm really sleepy," he said. "I haven't had a good night's sleep." "You'll sleep through the quiet hour at daycare," Caroline said. "Come on, Ariel's awake." Caroline made sure her son got out of bed and left his room. Then she helped her daughter to wash and brush her teeth, dressed her, helped her son to get dressed, and they left the flat as a friendly group. Benjamin Willis's family lived on the 4th floor, and the relatively long walk down the stairs helped Adrian cheer up. Once outside, they almost stepped into a puddle from the heavy rain of the night before. The old flat canopy over the entrance was visibly damaged. It had been broken by local hooligans a couple of years ago, and every autumn the residents of this entrance felt the consequences of their drunken misdemeanor. And time has not spared it. In the courtyard of the house, right in front of the entrance, there was already a car in which Benjamin was sitting. "Will you run to the car yourself?" Caroline asked, smiling. She bent down to the children. "Mum, there's still a puddle here," Ariel said in a low voice. "Okay," the young mum grinned and took the kids by the hands and walked them to the car. "Are you ready?" Dad asked as Adrian and Ariel got into the car. "Did you get everything?" "Yes, we're ready," they said almost in unison. "Well, let's go," Benjamin exclaimed with a childlike enthusiasm. Then he turned to the window, rolled down the glass, and said to his wife, "I'll try not to be long." "Good," Caroline replied quietly. She smiled and watched the car with her favorite people drive away from their yard. Caroline quickly walked back into the driveway, fearing that it might start to rain. On the right side of the sky, huge black clouds covered the sky. They were moving in their direction. Caroline had a busy day ahead of her. She had written to her boss, Mr. Carl, yesterday that she was planning to take some time off today. The boss didn't object and kindly gave one of his best employees the day off. Caroline worked as the lead designer for a home improvement company in their town. She selected wall colors, furniture, and generally her job was to offer the finished interior of the flat according to the client's conditions. Caroline was always conscientious in her work, often going over her allotted hours, and Mr. Carl appreciated her very much. But today the girl had another task to put her own place in order. After all, 2 children, one of the reasons for the constant clutter in the flat. She did not always have time to clean up the toys scattered around the house at once, putting it off for the next day. Yesterday, Benjamin came home from work with a bus-like children's tent, and instantly the living room felt like a bomb of children's toys had exploded. Sure, Caroline could clean up and not slack off. But in addition to cleaning the house, she had to see her mother-in-law for the first time in years. She was flying in to visit them today, and had to be picked up from the airport in the afternoon. She had lived in Belarus for a long time, and had not contacted her son or his family at all for several years. Today was to be the first time she would see her grandchildren, but the first meeting with her grandchildren should be in a clean flat, Caroline thought as she walked back into the house. It was 4 hours before her mother-in-law was due to arrive, and she had plenty of time to clean up. Once inside the flat, she decided to grab a quick bite to eat and then tackle the task at hand. The living room was combined with the kitchen, so she had to have breakfast in the company of colorful Barbie dolls, Transformers, and other representatives of the toy world. Caroline started to put things in order as soon as she had breakfast, and she didn't hesitate. First of all, she had to sort the toys, the ones Adrian played with, into his room and her daughter's toys into her room. It was not an easy task because both her son and daughter had a lot of toys, and it was difficult to remember which one was which. She could have asked the children to put the toys away themselves, which she usually did. But this time, when they were content to go to sleep one by one, she decided to make an indulgence and clean up after them herself. Caroline decided to let the children rest, and Benjamin supported her in this. All of Ariel's dolls, all of Adrian's Transformers, Caroline thought, and sat down on the terry gray rug she had picked up herself and began to scatter these children's toys into 2 different piles. In the background, she switched on the television hanging on the wall in front of the sofa and, listening to some morning news of world events, unwittingly became absorbed in thinking about the day ahead. Caroline, having delved little into the biography of her husband of 27 years, it somehow did not particularly bother her, and she was quite satisfied with what she knew about him rather superficially. She knew that he had been brought up in a broken home because his father, a brave and valiant fireman, had been killed while fighting one of the fires. His mother, Mrs. Gwyneth, had brought him up quite strictly, which was why he was such an exemplary father who never scolded his children. He wanted to protect them from the kind of upbringing he had received. Benjamin learned to be a locksmith and now worked in a rather prestigious company in the city. Then, when the guy turned 20, something happened to his mother and she started calling her son endlessly. There were calls of completely different content and reasons from son. "How are you doing?" to "I can't find my slippers." Benjamin persuaded her to get tested, and afterward she assured her son that she had chronic fatigue. He didn't really understand the relationship between this diagnosis and her problems, which she reported to him every time she called, but he accepted the fact and began to devote more time to the already elderly woman. By then he and Caroline had met and she understood. She supported him in this, saying that if she had to help him, she was ready to help him. Benjamin started visiting her more often, talking to her on the phone more and more. 6 months had passed since Mrs. Gwyneth had announced her diagnosis to her son, and she had decided that she needed to go on holiday. She was already retired. She informed her son that she was going to Canada to visit some old friend. Benjamin didn't remember her specifying exactly who or where she was going for an unknown period of time and just disappeared. Any attempts to call her or contact her in any way were fruitless. Benjamin thought that their operator was out of service in Canada, or Mrs. Gwyneth had simply changed her SIM card to a Canadian one, and concluded that he would not disturb his mother's rest. If it was really that important to her, he made the decision to leave her alone. That was all Caroline knew. Until recently, her mother-in-law had made no sign of her at all. Benjamin hadn't bothered much about it either, saying that his mum had probably just decided to go into recluse. Her supposed life in Canada or elsewhere was of little interest to the man, because he was focused on himself and his family. Just a week before that day, his son's phone had received a call from an obscure number. Benjamin was not in the habit of not receiving calls from unknown numbers, so he didn't hesitate to answer. "Hello, this is Benjamin Willis," said a husky female voice. "Hello, this is Benjamin Willis. Who's calling?" The man was always careful when talking to strangers on the phone. Tried never to say the word yes. "It's your mum," Benjamin, the woman said quietly, and then fell silent. "Mum, is that you?" Benjamin immediately fidgeted and rejoiced. "How are you?" "Where are you, Mum?" "Son, I'll be flying back soon. I'm sick of Canada. I want to go home. Tell me, have you and the baby moved?" "We did, Mum. But we're still in the same town. Mum's been somewhere all this time." "I'll fly back, son, and we'll talk then. Then I'll keep this number. We'll call again. I'm going to bed now, son. Good night." The phone rang 3 short beeps. The very conversation with his mother, with whom Benjamin had had no contact for 7 years, seemed painfully strange to him. She expressed no emotion, nothing that would indicate that his mother missed him. The impression was that she wasn't saying it, but reading from a piece of paper. Undoubtedly, the emotions in Benjamin's body took over, and he was unable to think straight. At this moment, he was very relieved that his mum was all right, and that she would even return to them soon. But something in both the woman's voice and the conversation itself made him wonder. He immediately told Caroline, who was reading Ariel a bedtime story. And she, too, rejoiced. They began to prepare themselves for the relatives' arrival, and also to prepare the children for the fact that they would soon meet their grandmother. Caroline had no parents. She spent her entire childhood in an orphanage. As soon as she turned 18, the state gave her a flat. For some time, the couple lived in it. And then, as soon as there was a mutual desire to have children, they sold this small living space and bought a larger flat to equip each planned child with a room. And for these children, the first meeting with their only grandmother was to go well. So Adrian and Ariel were immediately aware that they would soon have a new relative in their lives. Half an hour later, the living room floor had been completely cleaned and there was nothing extra left on it. All the toys had been successfully distributed to the rooms. It remained to mop the floors where there was a carpet and vacuum and dust all the shelves. It was not a difficult task, and Caroline planned to do it in an hour and a half. She decided to clean the floors last, just before she left for the airport. For now, she expected to vacuum where needed and dust all the shelves in the house. While waiting for Benjamin to return from kindergarten, her husband didn't wait long and returned without the children an hour after she had left with them. "Hi," said Caroline, wiping the dust, took the kids. "Is everything okay?" "Hi." "Yeah," Benjamin answered as he took off his jacket and walked into the living room. "I took the kids. They can't wait to meet their grandmother," she said with a small grin. "Who can't wait?" Benjamin smiled. "You know, I can't figure out if there's something wrong with her. Maybe I've forgotten what she's supposed to be like, but I think she's changed a lot in the last 7 years. I talked to her on the phone and I don't recognize her." "You've answered your own question," Caroline said. "You've just forgotten her. You haven't seen or heard from her in 7 years? Benjamin, you're just used to it." "I hope so," Benjamin said and sat down on the couch. He looked at the electronic wristwatch, which didn't activate at first, shook his hand a little and looked at the time. "We should be leaving in an hour and a half to 2 hours," he said. "Yes, to be on time. "It's not raining outside." Caroline turned round and took off the gloves she'd been using to clean the flat. Not now, but it looked like it was going to. Caroline looked at her husband, who at that moment was thinking hard about something and looking at one point. "You look worried," she said, and sat down on the sofa next to Benjamin. He turned and looked at her for a second. Then, as if returning from the world of thought to the world of reality, he changed his expression. "I can't get that conversation out of my head," he said grudgingly. "I can't fucking figure out what happened to her. Just replaced a person." "Benjamin," Caroline said calmly, "you haven't seen each other in 7 years. There's a lot of things you could have overlooked, put out of your mind. You could have just forgotten her behavior." "No, Caroline, she wasn't like that. She was a, iron woman, but she always had feelings and emotions. She wasn't that." "Listen," she said. "By the way, I didn't understand. Where is the mother-in-law going to live? The first night she, of course, will sleep over at our place. But beyond that?" The man frowned. "I don't know. Caroline, we'll see." Benjamin frowned. "She sold her flat then." "Did she?" Caroline asked anxiously. She suddenly felt the weight of her mother-in-law's impending arrival. She had not asked where Mrs. Gwyneth was going to live. She had asked about the flat, not because she really didn't remember it, but because she hoped that her husband didn't particularly want his mother-in-law to be in their flat all the time either. But it wouldn't last forever, would it? And her plans were unknown. Would she be coming for a long time or forever? The anxiety was based on the fact that Caroline did not know her mother-in-law and how she would behave towards her grown-up family, her grandchildren, and even towards the girl herself she could not even guess. The only thing that was clear was that she was very happy that she had grandchildren. Everything else in Mrs. Gwyneth's intentions and mood was unknown. "Yes," she has said, her husband calmly. "How long is she coming back for?" "Forever." "Forever," Caroline exclaimed desperately, looking at Benjamin pitifully. The girl's mood had changed dramatically in the last few hours. She was still ready to support her husband in this awkward and very exciting situation, when both son and mother were actually separated. But she was now not at all willing to let this meeting drag on, and the meeting, she believed, would drag on. It was a standard pattern that Caroline had heard about from various melodramas, magazines, and articles. An elderly mother who simply gets bored sitting alone in retirement, moves in with her son's family on any pretext, and eventually begins to terrorize her daughter-in-law. And if this situation in Benjamin's family began to develop in this way, Caroline, as she now reasoned, could go to very radical measures. An open scandal with her mother-in-law in front of the children, no questions asked, all for the sake of a brighter future. A scandal with her husband, same thing. The worst of all, as has been said, was the fact that Caroline hardly knew Mrs. Gwyneth. She only vaguely remembered her from the days when she and Benjamin had first started dating. And then her lover's mother had gone to Belarus. And nothing. Who had she become in the meantime? Somehow, in Caroline's imagination, she was an overbearing and rigid woman who sought to subjugate everything she saw. Some oppressive element loomed on the horizon of family harmony. And if she began to re-educate the children, it would be the worst act she could commit in the young girl's imagination. The backlash in such a case would not be long in coming. And then the always fair and kind, loving mum in the eyes of Adrian and Ariel would turn into a warrior knight who protects them from an unexpected attack. After all, accustoming a child to himself is a very simple task. It is worth a couple of times to take him to the cinema to some boring cartoon, buy him a few toys, and that's it. The child is under your complete control. In short, Caroline should have looked very carefully at her mother-in-law. She entertained hopes that she was very much mistaken. And in just an hour or two, she would meet not such an overbearing and uncompromising woman, which she imagined, but a genuinely kind and caring grandmother who appreciates her daughter-in-law, her work, and in no way will not interfere in the internal affairs of the family. Do you have a piece of paper and a marker? Caroline asked when they had reached the airport. Yes, I did, Benjamin answered. Look in the glove compartment, I put it there. Caroline opened the glove compartment and took out a plain white sheet of paper and a black marker. What do we write? Benjamin Willis's family, Caroline asked with a smile. Benjamin laughed too and said it was a good idea. Caroline put the piece of paper on the dashboard of the car, holding it with one hand while she opened the cap of the marker with the other. Caroline, in her beautiful handwriting, wrote the phrase she had just suggested, closed the cap, and put it back in the glove compartment. All set? She asked. Ugh, exhaled the husband. Ready. Let's go and meet her. The young people got out of the car and went into the airport building to meet Mrs. Gwyneth. Standing amidst the almost uninterrupted flow of arriving people with a leaflet on which the family name was written, Benjamin and Caroline peered ahead, glancing over the heads of the citizens in search of the relative they were looking for. The flight was the same one Mrs. Gwyneth had mentioned on the phone, and they were looking for her. How to recognize her among dozens, perhaps hundreds of other strange women was a mystery. Suddenly, in the midst of the crowd trying to get out of the airport, a hand with the exact same sheet of paper was raised above their heads, on which was written in some crooked handwriting looking for Benjamin Willis. And the young couple realized at once in what direction they should push through the crowd. They hurried towards the raised hand, looking up every now and then so as not to stray from the route to the hand stretched to the sky. It wasn't long before they reached their destination. Caroline glanced at the woman holding the leaf. She saw a rather elderly woman with a wrinkled face and strands of gray hair peeking out from under her burgundy beret. She was dressed in the same burgundy coat and wore no makeup at all. With her free hand, she was rolling a small suitcase. When she saw the young people and read what was written on the leaflet Caroline held, her eyes widened, her wrinkles smoothed, her hand dropped down, and in her husky voice, barely audible in the noise of the crowd, she spoke. Son. It's me, Mum. Mum Benjamin shouted, and in a burst of joy hugged his aged mother tightly. Son, you're all grown up now, Mrs. Gwyneth said as she released her from his embrace. And this she turned to Caroline. Is that you, Caroline, daughter? Yes, Mrs. Gwyneth. It's me, the girl replied shyly. I remember you too. Very young and ambitious. Very active, Mrs. Gwyneth continued. Wow, you're a beauty, I can tell you that. Yes, my son always chose the best. What are we standing here for, Mum? Benjamin asked cheerfully. Let's go to our house. We'll show you our flat, and then we'll get to know each other tonight. He took his mum under his arm and they walked slowly towards the exit of the hall. Caroline walked a little behind and was actually quite detached from the conversation between her husband and mother-in-law. It was understandable they had not seen each other for 7 years, and all her son's attention, of course, was now riveted on Mrs. Gwyneth. And the girl did not hinder this at all. She was really happy for her husband. He was very happy now. They squeezed through the flurry of people and exited the airport building and headed for the car park where their car was parked. Caroline, will you sit in the back? Benjamin asked as they approached the car. I missed my mum. Let her sit in the front with me. Yes, okay, no problem, the girl answered and sat in the back without any negative emotions. The mother-in-law sat comfortably on the front seat while her son was putting the suitcase in the boot. The woman slowly turned back so that she could see her daughter-in-law and asked, Caroline, how are you doing? Is Benjamin not hurting you? Is everything well with you? Yes, Mrs. Gwyneth, everything is fine. We live, we don't complain, we bring up our children. Everything's fine. Well, that's good. The most important thing is that you're doing well. As they chatted, Benjamin got back behind the wheel. The car started and they drove home. "Mom, tell me about it," Benjamin said very emotionally. "Where have you been all this time? No calls from you, no messages." "I've been living somehow. It's all good, son. Hungary, it just felt great. I've settled there." "What Hungary?" Caroline interrupted. "You've been to Canada, haven't you?" "Yes, Mum. What Hungary?" Benjamin wondered. And Mrs. Gwyneth looked at her son with stunned eyes. "Hungary?" Mrs. Gwyneth asked again. "What Hungary?" At this point, Caroline began to realize, still very vaguely, that something was wrong with the woman. Her illness, the so-called chronic fatigue, had not disappeared, but seemed to have progressed during the whole time she had been away from her loved ones. And seeing her husband's attitude, she feared that he too would realize this and decide to leave her mother to live with them, so that nothing would happen to her and she would always be monitored. "Did you just say something about Hungary?" "Mum, it's not clear," said the son. "No, son, you're confused. I was living in Canada with this woman." "What was her name?" "A friend of mine from a long time ago. We had a good life. You wouldn't believe it, it was like we'd been together for 7 years." "What 7 years did you break up with her for, Mum? I don't get it at all. What are you talking about?" Benjamin was clearly deluded and didn't understand a thing. "But you and I haven't seen each other for 7 years, son. Or have you forgotten?" "No, Mom. You just said you and your friend haven't seen each other in 7 years. And I don't understand that." "Oh yeah, well, I've been with my mate for 7 years, so to speak. I hope she'll come and visit me here too." Mrs. Gwyneth touched her forehead, as if remembering the name of that mysterious friend. "Lord, what was her name?" "Dorothy. Dorothy," she said. "Dorothy? Mrs. Gwyneth, did you take the pills they prescribed you?" "You know, for your chronic fatigue," Caroline asked. "I did. That's what Dorothy always said, don't refuse. Take what you're given, it was a saying or something nowadays." "Don't refuse what? What did they give you, Mum?" "I don't understand anything at all. What are you talking about?" Benjamin frowned, which meant he was either thinking hard or he didn't understand at all. "That's what Dorothy told me. She's a friend of mine from Canada. I haven't seen her in 7 years, son. Can you believe it? I hope she won't leave me here too." "Mrs. Gwyneth," said Caroline, rather loudly compared to the pensioner, "have you got those pills they prescribed you? Do you have them with you now?" "Yes, daughter, I have them in my suitcase. Dorothy gave them to me. She did." "Do you know why?" Dorothy said, "Well, you see, these pills, don't take them, or I'll stop talking to you," that's what she said. "She put the pills in there so I'd remember not to take them. That's it." "Mum, I don't understand anything at all," Benjamin said tensely. "Who is this friend? Do you have her number? Let me call her, we'll figure it out now. Who have you been living with all this time? This is outrageous." "I was living with a friend. From Canada." "What's her name?" "Dorothy." "That's right, I lived with her for 7 years. And now we're separated by that plane. I hope she'll visit me here. It'll be a pleasure. I had a good time with her. We were soulmates." Caroline looked at it all detachedly and did not take her mother-in-law's words seriously. It was understandable the old woman was talking nonsense, confused in her own testimony, and also repeated a lot. Her mind was obviously not all right. And for the girl, it could mean only one thing: Benjamin would want her mother to stay with them, and he'd have an ironclad argument for it. He's not stupid. He also realizes that his mother's head is in big trouble. And the worst of it was that Caroline had not a single argument against these arguments. When Benjamin and Caroline got home, the first thing they did was talk about how nice their flat was. "Look, Mum, Caroline chose all this stuff herself. She's a designer," the man said excitedly. "Mum, it's a nice renovation, isn't it?" Yeah, guys, it's really nice. Congratulations, Mrs. Gwyneth said hoarsely, looking round the hallway. And that's just the entrance hall. Mum, let's go further in. You'll see the children's rooms, the living room and kitchen, our bedroom. Come on, Mum, get undressed. Benjamin helped his mother take off her coat and hang it on a secure hook in the hallway, and then slowly, holding her shoulder gently, led her forward. Caroline watched all this with great apprehension. She had seen her husband's mood and hoped very much that it was temporary, only a logical consequence of the 7-year gap between them. But still the worry that the obviously ill mother-in-law would stay with them did not give the girl any rest. She was more worried not even about the fact that she herself would have to sacrifice her personal freedom and time for the sake of a man virtually unknown to her, but about the fact that all this will be watched by the growing children. That was her greatest fear. Look, Mum, it's the living room, came her husband's voice from the back of the flat. And Caroline, catching herself thinking hard, took off her jacket and went inside. The drawing room, living room, as if the woman were trying to express delight, but she was not very good at it. Dorothy, may I sit here? Dorothy, who, Mum? Benjamin furrowed his eyebrows again. Mum, your friend Dorothy stayed in Canada, where you've lived for the last 7 years. There's no Dorothy here, Mum, but there's Caroline and me. Yes, Caroline? Yes, Mrs. Gwyneth, don't you worry about Dorothy. She's fine, and she misses you in Canada. Aha, the pensioner looked at the girl with wide-open eyes and made an expression, as if she had just learned something that had been kept from her all her life. Dorothy's in Canada, son, she duplicated to Benjamin. Toward evening, Benjamin went to pick up the children at daycare, leaving his wife and her mother alone. In the flat, the mother-in-law spent most of her time sitting in silence and watching television. It seemed that she was so deeply immersed in watching some incomprehensible series that she had completely forgotten where she was and who was around her. Though she may have forgotten that even before she started watching TV. Benjamin and the kids didn't take long to arrive and returned just 40 minutes after leaving. Okay, guys, the young father said, turning back as they pulled up in front of the house. Get ready. You're about to meet your grandmother. Hooray! Shrieked the children and raised their little hands, tightly clenched into fists, upwards. Adrian was first in the hallway, followed quietly by Ariel, followed, of course, by Benjamin. Little Adrian had a look of anxiety on his face. He didn't know what to expect from his new relative, and Ariel didn't understand how to behave, so she repeated her brother's emotions. Well, children, why are you going so slowly? Benjamin said cheerfully. Look, Grandma's watching TV. Come on, kids, let's get acquainted. But the children didn't want to obey. They cautiously approached the sofa where Grandma was sitting. Caroline, who was watching this picture from the living room kitchen, sitting at the table and reading something on her phone, immediately began to feel fear for the children. She was afraid that, because of the strange grandmother, they might get some psychological trauma. Mum, Benjamin said almost in a whisper, Look who's here to see you. It was only then that Mrs. Gwyneth noticed the children coming towards her. Oh, she exclaimed excitedly. But her hoarse voice made it sound more like a cry for help than joy. My grandchildren have come. As quickly as possible, the old woman rose from the sofa and hurried to her suitcase, which Benjamin had placed next to the dresser in the living room. Now, boys, I brought you presents. My friend from the Czech Republic gave them to me. I haven't seen her in 7 years, said Mrs. Gwyneth. You know what, kids? Oh, what toys she made. Good toys. She gave you presents when we were in Hungary with her. Now, darlings. Well, in Adrian's room, so in Adrian's room. Come on, guys. And Grandma's just so excited to meet you. I'm going to read you a story and then she's going to give you presents. Okay? Caroline asked. Yes, said the children. And Caroline went with them to her son's room. The door slammed shut behind them. Benjamin looked at it with some anger in his eyes. "These are my grandchildren," he said. "Son, have you met them yet?" "You know, son, Dorothy gave me some presents to give to my granddaughters. I can't find them. Can you believe it, son? Dorothy will soon introduce you to my granddaughters." "Don't worry," Benjamin replied hurriedly. "All right, Mum, let me help you pack." He bent down once more to retrieve the papers, and this time no one distracted him. Pulling out a few memorable pieces of paper, he turned them over face up, with something printed on them. "And this, son, is from a friend in Hungary," said Mrs. Gwyneth. "What's her name?" "Dorothy gave it to me, I think, and told me not to show it to anyone. Said keep it under 7 locks, but how am I supposed to keep it under lock and key when I'm supposed to meet my granddaughters? I haven't seen them in 7 years. They flew in from Canada. I'm a grandmother now, Benjamin. I already have granddaughters and Dorothy doesn't." "Why did Dorothy tell you not to show this to anyone?" Benjamin asked warily. "T.A. Dorothy is a friend of mine from Canada," Mrs. Gwyneth explained. Benjamin sighed. He decided to familiarize himself with what his mother had told him he could never know. When he saw what was written on those papers, his mouth dropped open in a mute scream. His eyes widened to the size of 5-ruble coins. And his breathing quickened as if he had just run a 5-kilometer marathon without respite. "Tell me, what was that?" Benjamin asked, entering the bedroom when Caroline was already lying in bed under the covers, reading a novel by the dim light of the floor lamp. "What are you talking about?" The wife deliberately pretended not to know what her husband was talking about. "You know exactly what I mean," he replied. "Why did you take the children away when Mum wanted to give them presents?" Caroline was naturally torn inside by emotions that she wanted to spill out immediately. But she held them back so as not to cause a scandal. "Benjamin," Caroline called out. She put the book back on the nightstand. "I can see how they're reacting to Mrs. Gwyneth. They didn't realize it was their grandmother at all. I think they just thought we'd brought home some random pensioner who's just chatting away." "What are you implying?" The man frowned. "Benjamin. Well, haven't you noticed?" Caroline spoke calmly, trying not to let a single gram of emotion into her words. "I can see that you've noticed it yourself. It's very hard not to. Your mom's talking a lot of incoherent nonsense. And I think, if you'll excuse me, that she has some kind of mental problem." Benjamin didn't say anything, but just sighed heavily and put his head down. "Okay, yes," he replied just as calmly. "When you took the kids into the room, I helped her gather the disintegrated items from the suitcase." He sighed again. "And you know, it's very unpleasant and probably even painful to say, but I saw the psychiatric discharge." What Caroline was genuinely surprised. How was she allowed on the plane alone? "I've yet to find out. Her GP's name was Dorothy Morris, and Mum was actually in Canada the whole time. She was being treated at a neuropsychiatric hospital for it's hard for me to say this, schizophrenia. Yes, my mum has schizophrenia, and there's nothing I can do about it. I understand it was diagnosed 7 years ago. I honestly don't understand how they let her back and forth, especially on an aeroplane and on her own. And why was she even released? Like I said, I'll be looking into that." "Oh my God," Caroline exclaimed. She knew her mother-in-law had a lot of problems, of course, but she hadn't realized that the diagnosis would be so dire. "Yes," Benjamin confirmed with a tightening of his lower lip. "It's not a good situation." "What are you going to do?" "Find out why she was discharged in the first place, and secondly, why she was allowed on the plane alone. And thirdly, of course, support her. I'm going to do everything I can to keep her from losing her mind. I'll go and see a psychiatrist tomorrow. I'm not going to let this go." "Did you make her a bed?" Caroline asked worriedly. Yes, I made up the sofa in the living room. Apparently, we're going to have to squeeze in a bit more from now on. In a way, Caroline had already realized what Benjamin was getting at. It was a real stab in the back for her. She was not jealous, nor did she feel any anxiety about her husband's very abrupt attention to Mrs. Gwyneth, rather than to herself. But she was very much afraid for her children. To see such a thing at such a young age. An unprepared child's psyche could not bear it. Caroline Benjamin said to her, "I really hope you understand. I'll tell you, I'm not leaving Mum. She's sick, and she's seriously ill. Putting her in some kind of dispensary or some kind of mental hospital. I just don't trust those doctors. But I trust myself, and I trust you, and I trust the kids. And I think that we all together can at least prevent this process from continuing. I really hope that we can at least keep this disease at the level that it is now. I don't think my mum is any kind of threat, but understand, I don't want to lose her again. So I'm really counting on your support and Ariel's support. But I insist that Mum lives with us." That night, Caroline slept very badly. Even though they hadn't had any scandals or open arguments with Benjamin, her nerves had been frayed the previous night. When her husband was snoring, she turned her head to the other side and realized that she had insomnia. She fidgeted in the bed in search of the most comfortable position, tried to force herself to fall asleep and not think about anything, but nothing to think about just did not work. She lay there planning what to do next. Her husband Benjamin was enveloped by the awakened love and care for his mother that he had not been able to enjoy for 7 years. She was well aware that this was normal before, but she also realized that this awakened feeling in him would continue for a long time to come. It could have a very disastrous effect on their relationship in the family. A flourishing harmony was out of the question now that she had thought through all the possible scenarios. After the arrival of her mother-in-law, she had never imagined that things would be so complicated and dangerous. Eventually, she did manage to doze off. Moral fatigue took over. She had a very strange dream. She was standing in the middle of an incomprehensible white room with absolutely nothing in it, just a dull white and incomprehensibly glowing space. She just stood in it, and it was as if she couldn't move. She was looking for something in this white room, but what? There was absolutely nothing here in empty space. Her torso felt as if it were restrained, but she kept looking in the monochrome room for something. Suddenly she felt that she could move. She immediately began to search for something, but she didn't know what it was. She wandered around this white room, extremely anxious and unable to understand anything. Suddenly she heard a child crying behind her. Her eyes widened, her body stiffened with incomprehensible fear, and she turned round. Behind her she saw Adrian. He was running away so fast and fast that it seemed impossible to catch up with him. He was running and crying loudly. "Stop, Adrian, don't run," Caroline shouted, trying to calm her son so that he would listen to her and stop. "Adrian, wait." But the boy had no intention of stopping. He ran on and didn't even turn round at his mum's shouts. Caroline started to run faster. She sped up so fast that it looked like she was about to catch up with him. Her hand reached for him and was about to lay on his shoulder when suddenly the young mum crashed into an invisible barrier. The passage was closed to her. She started banging on this barrier, which had the sound of armored glass. She shouted, for she saw her son running away from her and not even paying attention to her. But there was another sound behind her, and it was no longer a child's cry. Behind her, she heard a hoarse and painfully familiar laugh. She turned round again, and this time it was Mrs. Gwyneth standing in front of her. She was laughing at the top of her lungs, pointing her finger at her daughter-in-law. The sound of her laughter echoed off the invisible and inexplicable walls of the white room, echoing painfully in the girl's ears. Then the old woman began to make faces, thus as if to show her dominance over the girl. She mocked her, tried to humiliate her. In response, Caroline only knelt down and sobbed like her little child, who had just run away from her in an unknown direction. Caroline was awakened by the joyous cry of her husband. "Adrian," he said loudly. "Come on, hurry up. If we delay, we'll be late for daycare and Grandma won't be able to see him. You want Grandma Gwyneth to know where you're playing with the other kids, don't you?" "Do you? Well then, hurry up and show Granny Gwyneth where your things hang." It was a prodding tone with which the man seemed to be beckoning the children, offering them the dubious pleasure of a trip to the daycare center with Grandma Gwyneth. He got up before I did. A thought flashed through Caroline's still sleepy mind, and she jumped out of bed instantly. The door to their bedroom was open, and she could see what was going on in the main part of the flat. "Dad, why is Gran coming with us?" asked Ariel, already dressed by her father. "Why would she?" Benjamin squatted down in front of his little daughter. "Grandma wants to know where you spend your time. She doesn't know you at all yet, and she wants to get to know you better. Do you understand?" "I don't understand," Ariel said thoughtfully. "Well, you don't understand yet, but you will soon enough." He smiled and got to his feet. "Mom, you'll be there soon. Ariel and I are just waiting for you." Caroline, hearing this, immediately got out of bed finally and quickly went out into the living room. "Good morning, everyone." She tried to pretend she was happy. "Why didn't you wake your mom?" "Daddy woke us up." Ariel ran up to her mom and hugged her legs. "That's my girl," Caroline said, and hugged her daughter back. "Are you going to daycare?" "Yes," Benjamin answered. "I want to take Mum with us. Let her go for a ride. At least she can see where her grandchildren are being raised." "Where's Mrs. Gwyneth?" Caroline looked round, but she didn't see her mother-in-law. "She decided to take Adrian to daycare herself," Benjamin said enthusiastically, and looked in the direction of his son's room. At that moment, Caroline's mind turned upside down again. "How do I put this together myself?" she asked herself, and her inner voice repeated the question. At the same moment, Mrs. Gwyneth herself came out of Adrian's room with a striding gait, holding her little grandson by the hand. "We haven't seen her for 7 years," she told him. Caroline looked at her husband with angry eyes, but he smiled as if not noticing it, looking at his mother. "Well, are we all ready?" he asked, still as cheerfully. And when the children reluctantly answered him, "Yes," he led them into the hallway. Come on, now we're going to show Grandma where your garden is. And I'll show you where the crayfish are," Caroline thought at that moment. And at that moment she involuntarily realized that a scandal had become inevitable. She was simply obliged to protect her children in this situation. Not only should they not be witnesses to their father's behavior, and their grandmother's too, of course, but they certainly should not become participants in this clowning. "Everyone, Caroline, wait for Mum and me. We'll be back soon." He looked at her from the hallway. "Mum will be sharing her impressions of this morning's trip around town." "Yes, Mum?" "Yes, son, yes, I'll be getting acquainted with my children's nursery now," Mrs. Gwyneth said with a smile on her face, glancing back and forth at her son and daughter-in-law. "Bye, Caroline, we'll be quick." When they left the flat, Caroline, finding herself alone for a short time, decided to make a final decision on the matter. She already knew for sure that she would tell her husband everything she thought about it soon, maybe even today. And what next? If the husband, stupefied by his mother's condition, wants a divorce over this, well, the flat was shared, as they'd bought it when they were already married. And if the dreaded divorce was glittering on the horizon, the housing would have to be shared. Another thing was that it was possible to rent some flat for a while, since even the girl's own salary would allow for such expenditures. At the same time, there would still be money left over for the full maintenance of herself and 2 small children. But how stressful is it for the boys? What a horror. They have to endure right now, and, God forbid, will have to endure further. The situation was truly nightmarish, but the girl simply saw no other way out of it. In the end, she decided that if her husband threw her out of the flat, she would be satisfied with the rented one for the first time. Then after some time, she would probably take another flat in the mortgage, and there she and the children would continue to live happily without this asylum in their own flat. Soon Benjamin and Mrs. Gwyneth returned from their morning drive, and he was prodding his mother to share her impressions. "Well, Mum, tell Caroline what you think of the daycare center your grandson and granddaughter go to," Benjamin said with a smile. "Oh, Benjamin, everything is good. The daycare center is good and everything is wonderful. And the city is nice. Budapest doesn't have one like this. Dorothy never showed me one." Benjamin's mother was still in a delirious state, and almost every sentence she spoke was accompanied by a reference to that unfortunate Dorothy in Budapest, which she had never been to. It was beginning to annoy Caroline. The day passed as if on pins and needles. Caroline could hardly restrain herself from telling her husband everything right away. She locked herself in their bedroom and ordered, but was distracted every now and then by thoughts of the misfortune that was coming to their family. What could she do? There was no other option. Benjamin devoted the whole day to Mrs. Gwyneth, spending time with her, trying to talk to her about something. But as usual, any conversation with her sooner or later came to a dead end of non-existent facts from her biography. He decided that today he would stay at home, warned his superiors about it, and for 3 days remained at his complete disposal, because what followed were 2 days off. In the evening, when she and her mother-in-law went for another drive to pick up Adrian and Ariel from daycare, Caroline began frantically pacing around the flat, contemplating the evening ahead. Caroline took one last breath, gathered her strength, and said, "Can this go on like this for long? I understand, but this wasn't our agreement. I realized if she'd come for a period of time, I'd have no complaints. But she came here to live. We realized she was ill, and you said she'd stay to live with us. Benjamin, I just have one question for you. What are you doing?" "What's wrong with you, seriously?" he asked the girl with a stony look. "What's wrong with me? I'm not happy with everything. Benjamin, your sick mom lives with us. But you didn't even ask me about it. It's like you've been switched overnight, and you've forgotten what solidarity and mutual respect are. Benjamin, you know what I'm talking about. I understand that you haven't seen your mother for a long time, and after seeing her, you have this love for her. But why did it make you lose your mind along with her? What exactly is your problem?" he asked separately and even more tensely. "It's unbearable," Caroline said. "I have to squeeze into my own flat. I have to protect our children from the nightmare you've given them. You realize that Adrian is 5 years old and Ariel is 4. They're still little. Benjamin, you know. And I highly doubt you've prepared them for this. It's so stressful for them. I can't even imagine how they'd feel." "What are you talking about?" Benjamin snapped out of it. "My mother doesn't have much time left to live. I don't know how long, but it's not long. And you want her to spend the rest of her life in a mental institution. No, Caroline, I will not allow that. Benjamin, she lives in our flat. Not yours, not mine, but ours, okay? And you didn't consult me about it at all. You put me on the spot. I don't want our children to see this nightmare. Do you understand? You only think about yourself and your sick mom, but you don't think about how hard it is for me and the kids to live in this environment. What makes you think the kids are uncomfortable? They told me. Benjamin, you don't even ask them. You're just feeding them tons of this crazy, delusional stuff your mother spews out. I've got nothing against her, you know. I want what's best for her, but I want what's best for my children, who are now forced to endure this nightmare because of your stupid whim. Benjamin was extremely tense. So you want to wall the children off from their own grandmother? Yes? Yes, Caroline shouted. Because they're not going to get any use out of a grandmother like that. You know, God forbid they have some kind of psychological trauma from having little kids living in the same house with insanity. I seriously doubt they like it. Benjamin. Our children shouldn't have to see your mother in that state, much less be involved in her life in any way. So that's it. Benjamin tensed even more. Okay, I heard you. And he instantly calmed down, as if there had been no scandal before. I'll do my best not to let the kids see this. I promise. The next morning, Caroline was urgently called into work for some important meeting with the designers. Mr. Carl was polite but made it clear that this meeting was very important and Caroline's presence was mandatory. He didn't want to hear any excuses or cancellations. The girl went to work in the morning, and the children were taken to the daycare center again by Benjamin and Mrs. Gwyneth. Throughout the day, Caroline was very much winded. The meeting was long and very complicated. They discussed plans for commissioned projects for the next year, allocating them to different designers. Caroline had a lot of work to do, 6 major projects for next year, all of which had to be completed on time. She was free when evening was taking over the space and gradually pushing the autumn sun behind the clouds. It was still a long way from dark, and so that there would be no fuss in the evening, Caroline had decided to pick up the children from daycare herself. She would have to overpay the taxi driver, but she didn't see that as a problem. The most important thing for her was that her children spent less time with their crazy grandmother and gradually going crazy father. Arriving at the daycare center, Caroline walked into the corridor of the group where her children were brought up. There was only one group. The brother and sister were lucky to be placed together, despite their different ages. There were few parents here, already dressing their children to go home. Usually all the kids were picked up later, but now Caroline wasn't alone in her decision to pick up the kids early. She said hello to all the mums she knew and called out to the childminder who was with the children at the moment. When she saw the young mother, the teacher named Mrs. Tiffany nodded, and Caroline knew that her children were about to be taken out into the corridor. But Mrs. Tiffany, stepping out into the corridor where the children's lockers were, held only Ariel by the handle. "Hello, where's Adrian?" Caroline asked in confusion. "Hello. Adrian wasn't at daycare today. Dad only brought Ariel. He said he wasn't feeling well today and would stay home." "That's strange." Caroline frowned. "I thought he was fine yesterday." "Well, we'll figure it out." Having collected her daughter, Caroline left the building, went to the taxi that was waiting for her, and they drove home. "Mum, where's Adrian?" Ariel asked in a low voice when they were already in the car. "Adrian is home. The teacher said Daddy decided to keep him." "Mum, he's not home," the little girl said sadly. "Grandma's taking him away." "Where did she decide to take him?" "I don't know. When we were going to the kindergarten, Dad and Grandma said that Adrian should be taken away. And Grandma said she'd take him." "Grandma said that?" Caroline asked in surprise. "Yes," replied Ariel. "When we get home, I'll deal with Grandma," Caroline said quietly. And neither she nor her daughter said another word on the way home. Caroline was depressed for the second day. Tears were pouring from her eyes, and of course she didn't even try to hold them back. Things were very bad. The world had lost all its colors, and frankly speaking, she didn't really want to live. And the thing was, Adrian wasn't home that day. When Caroline got home, she sent Ariel to her room and went to confront Benjamin about why he'd left the baby at home. She was sure to the last minute that Adrian was just sitting in his room minding his own business. As she approached her husband, she asked what was the matter, why he had decided to leave him at home, telling the childminder that he wasn't feeling well. She was so angry because her husband had promised her to shield the children from his mother's bad influence. They were not to see her condition because, as Caroline had already explained to him, it could provoke them to develop some psychological trauma. The question put to him was not answered by the husband. He, sitting on the sofa with his mother, still watching some soap operas, duplicated his words of yesterday that the children should be isolated from Mrs. Gwyneth. He didn't say anything else. Caroline decided to check her son's room, but he wasn't there. It had been 2 days since her son had gone missing. Her husband had not answered any of her questions, only saying that it was imperative to file a missing persons report with the police. But she did not trust him, as she understood that it was his mother, to whom he was now very much attached, most likely to persuade him to hide Adrian. Sleep proved to be restless then. Benjamin's mother was effectively destroying her children's family. Caroline told her husband that she had already filed a missing child report and that he didn't need to do anything. Of course, she resented Benjamin. Although, could it really be called resentment? She was angry. She felt hatred for her husband. Whenever she had tried to ask him where Adrian had gone, he had replied that it was imperative to keep his son away from his grandmother. He gave no other answers. It was simply not possible to achieve anything on his own. Caroline was in no hurry to make a police report. She was so desperate that her legs just didn't want to carry her to the police station. What was there to say about the station? Sometimes even getting out of bed to go to the loo was an impossible task. The depression developed very quickly. And the worst part was still Ariel seeing it all. She saw her brother missing, her crazy grandmother and father, and her dejected mother. Benjamin took her to daycare and didn't seem to wake his wife on principle. In the morning, she would wake up after Ariel was in the daycare center. She did not understand where her child was. She didn't know even approximately where he could have disappeared, or rather, where her crazy relatives could have taken him. They'd really gone off the rails. Mrs. Gwyneth was understandable. Her condition confirmed her diagnosis. Benjamin, on the other hand, was more complicated. He seemed so obsessed with these very diagnoses of his mom's that he was even willing to sacrifice his own child. And Caroline was sure he was slowly losing his mind, too. 2 days after Adrian went missing, Caroline decided to file a police report after all. She went to the station, where she was questioned about all the circumstances that might have preceded the disappearance. She was unable to say anything, only that her child was missing. It was very mentally difficult for her to report that, quite possibly, her spouse had abducted her son himself. That same day, Caroline decided to pick up her daughter from daycare. She didn't want Ariel to suffer the same fate as Adrian. Where had he been all this time? How was he now? Was he even alive? All this thinking made her want to fall to her knees and scream at the top of her voice. But the girl was in such a depressed state that even this she could not do. At the entrance to the kindergarten building, she saw standing on the porch a man with a cap in the corner who was quietly smoking. He had a very thick mustache of a dark color. He was also wearing thick-rimmed glasses. Caroline noticed him, but she didn't think much of it, even though she hadn't seen this man here before. But now she didn't care at all. When she entered the corridor of the group with colorful lockers, she saw the teacher helping some boy to undress. Caroline walked inside with a tired gait and called out to the teacher. "Mrs. Tiffany," "Hello," she mumbled faintly. "I'm here to pick up Ariel early today." The teacher noticed the girl at once, and her eyes sparkled with a glint. She bent over to the boy she was helping, tapped him on the shoulder and clapped him. He turned to where the woman was pointing. "Mum," he shouted and ran to Caroline. Before she knew it, she was in the awkward embrace of her young son. She looked at the boy. It was an exact copy of Adrian, but he was somehow very pale. It was like he didn't look like himself. It was understandable. For 2 days a 5-year-old child had been away from his parents, and he was nowhere to be found. The crying child told his mum everything. As it turned out, when that morning, together with his father and grandmother, Mrs. Gwyneth, went to kindergarten, he heard the adults discussing some strange topic. "Caroline's mum doesn't want the children to see you," Dad said as he drove. "They need to be kept away from you." "Son, do what you think is right," Grandma replied in a husky voice. "If you need to take them somewhere, then take them. I don't mind." No, Mom, Dad continued. You have to make sure they don't see you or know you at all. Do you understand? Adrian, for example, Caroline says he's afraid of you. Afraid? Why would he be afraid of me? Grandma asked in surprise. I don't know, maybe he is. Of course he is. I don't do anything bad. Why should he be afraid of me? Well, if he is afraid, then he must be taken away. And there's nowhere and no one to take him. You see, Mum, the driver replied calmly. Then he needs to be given to someone without him seeing me. Adrian told Caroline that all the way to the kindergarten the strange conversations did not stop. The boy was very afraid and even took his sister's hand, thinking that it would be easier for him. And what did the father do when he came to the conclusion that the boy had to be given somewhere? He just dropped him off in the middle of town. Daddy, Daddy. The boy was crying and couldn't talk properly. Dad stopped the car and he just pulled me out of the car and just left me. He didn't say anything to you? Caroline asked tensely. Said I shouldn't see my grandmother. Said I was afraid of her, so it would be easier without her here, Adrian continued. And I did, and I did. And I went and cried, Mom. How did you get here, son? Did you walk here by yourself? Caroline asked. No, Uncle Joe helped me. He's the one with the mustache and the glasses, the boy chuckled. He met me in the evening, asked where my parents were. And he took me back to his place. He said that I shouldn't be afraid of him, and that tomorrow morning he would take me to my kindergarten. I told him where my daycare was today, and he took me. Caroline immediately looked towards the exit. She took her son's hand and headed towards the exit. There the man who called himself Uncle Joe was finishing his cigarette and was about to leave. Caroline sprinted out of the garden with Adrian and called out to him. Wait, she shouted, choking back tears. The man immediately turned round and, seeing the familiar boy, walked as fast as he could towards them. He confirmed everything Adrian had told his mom. He had met the boy on the street in the evening when he had been walking around the town looking for his mom, crying quietly. He immediately realized that there was something wrong and told him that he would take him to the daycare center. But it was already evening, and probably the kindergarten was already closed. For a long time, the man tried to find out which kindergarten Adrian attended. After several liters of tears, he was able to tell him that the kindergarten was called Rainbow. The very next day, the man took the child to the kindergarten. He gave him a lollipop and was leaving. Caroline took a report that her child was missing, but wrote a new report on her own husband, Benjamin. She told the investigator everything. The investigator also listened to the boy himself. As it later turned out, Benjamin's schizophrenia had worsened. He had it before, but only in a hidden form. And after a recent meeting with his mother, from whom he was separated for 7 years because of great stress, this terrible disease made itself known. Benjamin and his mother, Mrs. Gwyneth, were committed to a psychiatric hospital. The investigator promised to look into how this sick woman was allowed on the plane and why she was even released with her diagnosis. The children, of course, needed the help of a child psychologist. Adrian had, after all, developed a psychological trauma that made him very withdrawn and shy. But child psychologist Mrs. Sandra worked with him for a long time, and eventually the boy seemed to forget everything that happened to him. But the daughter didn't need a psychologist. After the examination, it turned out that the girl was fine. The only thing perhaps was that she was frightened by the behavior of her grandmother and father and was very worried when her brother disappeared. But all in all, everything was fine. The flat, of course, didn't have to be shared with anyone. The flat was left entirely to Caroline. She had unilaterally divorced Benjamin and didn't even visit him in the hospital. She had a great dislike for the man, even despite his diagnosis. Time passed and the family, certainly not in the same way as before, went on with their normal lives. The children were happy, and Mum was even happier.